Tonight, we're hitting the endless stretches of Texas highways, where the asphalt never seems to end and the night hides more than it reveals. These aren't just roads, they're veins running through the heart of Texas, pulsing with stories of vanishing hitchhikers, phantom trucks, and shadows that follow where no living thing should walk. Get ready for 20 of the creepiest highway encounters in the middle of Texas, stories that will make you think twice before driving alone at night. But before we begin, here's something strange. Most viewers make one huge mistake. They leave without subscribing. And by doing so, they miss out on the creepiest, spine-tingling tales that only the bravest dare to hear. Don't be one of them. Hit that subscribe button now, because tonight's just the beginning and the terror waiting in the darkness is far from over. So, where are you watching from? And what time is it there? Let me know in the comments, because here the night is only getting started, and the horror is waiting to unfold. Now, let's dive into the darkness. The desert at night has a way of swallowing sound until the only thing left is the crunch of your boots and the thud of your heart. Big Bend is a place that makes you feel small even in the daylight. Its canyons cut sharp and deep, its mesas stretching out under a sky that feels too big for human eyes. At night, it becomes something else entirely. The wind threads itself through the rock like a whisper, and the shadows crawl over the ground as if they are alive. That was the setting when we came across the fire. A glow that shouldn't have been there, flickering orange against the sheer walls of the canyon. We had been walking longer than we planned, the trail markers harder to follow under a thin moon. There were 5 of us, students mostly, except for Tyler, who had dropped out but tagged along for the hike anyway. He carried more whiskey than water in his pack. The others, Lindsay, Jorge, and Sarah, kept their eyes on the trail, half laughing, half cursing, already tired of Tyler's jokes. We were miles from the campground, deeper into the canyon than we should have been, when Sarah noticed it first. "Do you see that?" she whispered. We all stopped and squinted into the distance. There it was, a campfire, no doubt about it. The light flickered against the walls, shadows moving with the flame. My first thought was relief. We weren't the only idiots who had gotten lost out here. Maybe we could ask for directions, share a drink, laugh it off. But the closer we got, the more wrong it felt. The flame didn't crackle. It didn't waver the way a normal fire should when the wind pressed through the canyon. It was still and silent, as though painted onto the dark. Tyler shouted something, his usual smart remark, but the sound seemed to die before it reached the glow. We walked slower then, our boots scraping against the gravel path. I remember the way the hair rose on my arms, though the night wasn't cold. The canyon narrowed until the light filled the space ahead. There should have been smoke. There should have been the smell of wood burning. But there was nothing except that pale orange glow. And then, as we stepped into the clearing, it was gone. The fire vanished like someone had snapped their fingers. The 5 of us stood still, staring at the darkened ground. Where the fire had burned a moment earlier, there was only a ring of blackened bones, laid out with care in a perfect circle. Not wood, not stone. Bones, small and long, some curved, some jagged. They looked human. Too small to be cow or deer. Lindsay made a choking sound and staggered back. Jorge swore under his breath, muttering something about pranks, about weird locals. Tyler laughed, but it wasn't his usual laugh. It was thin and forced. The kind of sound people make when they don't want to admit they're scared. The bones were charred, as though they had been pulled from a fire long ago, and yet the ground beneath them was cool, the dirt undisturbed. Sarah knelt down before I could stop her. Reaching out like she needed to prove they were real, she touched one and hissed, jerking her hand back. "They're hot," she whispered. The circle seemed to hum then, a low vibration that I felt in my chest more than I heard with my ears. Tyler muttered that we should get moving, his eyes darting around the canyon walls like he expected someone to be watching us. We agreed, though none of us said it outright. We just turned and walked quickly, our packs bouncing, our lights trembling across the rocks. The problem was the trail didn't look the same anymore. The markers were gone, or maybe we had missed them, and the canyon walls rose higher, pressing us into a narrow throat of stone. The moonlight thinned until the sky was just a dark smear overhead. And then we saw it again, the fire. This time it was ahead of us on a ridge, burning bright and steady. The same circle, the same shadows flickering against the walls. "That's impossible," Lindsay whispered. But we were already moving toward it. Some part of us couldn't help it. "Like moths to a flame," Tyler muttered, and then laughed again, thin and nervous. When we reached the ridge, the fire vanished once more. The bones were there, the same ring, only this time they weren't blackened. They were white, clean, gleaming under the moon as though they had been scrubbed. The hum returned, deeper, heavier, pressing against our ribs. That was when Jorge lost it. He started shouting, waving his arms at the canyon walls, daring whoever was doing this to come out. His voice echoed back, jagged and strange, until it didn't sound like his voice at all, but something else repeating his words with a twisted cadence. He went pale, staggered, and fell silent. We tried to back away, but the canyon seemed to change around us, each turn leading us back to the same ridge, the same circle. Every time the fire would be there, glowing steady, and then it would vanish to reveal bones in a new state, blackened, white, broken, or wet with something dark that glistened in our flashlight beams. At some point, I lost track of time. My watch had stopped. Tyler stopped joking. Lindsay cried quietly, her shoulders shaking under her pack. Sarah clutched her burned fingers and wouldn't speak at all. The last time we saw the fire, it was closer than ever, right at our feet. And this time it didn't vanish. It flared high, taller than us, orange and hungry, though we still heard no crackle and smelled no smoke. Shapes moved in the flames, faces, stretched and hollow-eyed, mouths opening and closing as though screaming in silence. When the fire collapsed at last, it left nothing but ash. In the ash were 5 shapes, 5 skeletons, laid out neatly side by side. One of them had Sarah's necklace around its neck. We ran then, though I can't tell you how we escaped. I remember stumbling out of the canyon at dawn, the desert opening wide again, the light sharp and cruel after the night. Only 4 of us emerged. Jorge was gone. We told the rangers he had wandered off. They searched for days, found nothing. Sometimes I think about the bones in the fire, the way they matched our shapes so perfectly. Sometimes I think Jorge didn't disappear at all. He just took his place in the circle. And sometimes, late at night, I smell smoke that isn't there. When I close my eyes, I see that fire burning steady and silent, waiting for the rest of us to return. The mesquite trees in Palo Duro Canyon always looked strange at night, their branches gnarled and crooked like arthritic fingers trying to scratch the sky. By day, the canyon was breathtaking, a wound in the earth that went on for miles, its cliffs painted in layers of rust and ochre. But when the sun dipped and shadows stretched, the place shifted into something else entirely. The air grew stiller, heavier, and even the crickets seemed to stop their endless fiddling as if they too were listening for something in the silence. That summer, a group of us from Amarillo decided to spend a weekend camping there, thinking it would be just another trip filled with beer, laughter, and ghost stories we didn't believe. The first night began as expected. We set up camp not far from one of the overlooks, a place where the land suddenly dropped into an open throat of stone and darkness. The fire burned hot, cooking sausages and casting orange shadows against the canyon walls. The mesquites clustered thick near our tents, twisted together like they had secrets to keep. At first the sounds were ordinary. Coyotes yipping in the distance, the sigh of the wind pulling through brush, the occasional scuttle of a desert hare. Then as the night stretched deeper and the fire dwindled to embers, the wind shifted. It came down from the canyon rim, whistling low through the mesquite branches, carrying with it something that made the hairs on my arms stand up. At first I thought it was a trick of the wind, the way it sometimes makes a tree moan, but then it came again, clearer, cutting through the night air. It was my name, a voice soft, drawn out, almost like it was testing how the syllables felt rolling off its tongue. "Daniel." I froze, beer halfway to my mouth, and glanced around the fire. None of my friends were looking at me. They were lost in their own conversations, joking, half drunk. I thought maybe one of them had said it without realizing. But then it came again, from the dark clutch of mesquites just beyond our tents. "Daniel." My stomach tightened, my throat dry. It sounded like my mother's voice, the exact lilt, though she'd been dead for nearly 10 years. I didn't say anything. I just stared at the trees until one of my buddies, Kevin, noticed my expression. He laughed when I told him. "Canyon plays tricks," he said. "The wind bounces weird. Sounds like voices. Don't spook yourself." I wanted to believe him, but when I heard it again later after everyone had gone to their tents, I knew it wasn't just the wind. It wasn't calling anyone else, only me, and it was patient. I lay awake listening as the branches scraped together, whispering my name over and over until finally exhaustion won out. The next morning I thought maybe I'd dreamed it, that the beer had fogged things up. But when I stepped outside, I saw something that set my nerves on edge. In the dirt between the mesquites, clear as day, someone had drawn a spiral with a stick, winding in toward the center, like a funnel leading nowhere. My friends swore they hadn't done it. Nobody laughed this time. We covered it with dirt, pretending it was nothing, and went on with our day, hiking down into the canyon, sweating under the brutal Texas sun. But when night came again, so did the voices. This time they weren't just for me. As the fire burned low, Kevin stiffened, his head cocked. "Did y'all hear that?" he asked. We fell silent, listening. From the trees came a faint sing-song murmur, almost playful, and then, like a whisper, carried just close enough to be heard. "Kevin." His eyes widened, his face drained. Someone chuckled nervously, trying to lighten the mood. But when the voice came again, firmer this time, unmistakable, none of us laughed. "Kevin." He swore and stood up, scanning the trees with his flashlight. The beam cut through branches, but nothing moved. Nothing stirred. Still, the voice came again, softer, coaxing. That night, none of us slept easy. We lay in our tents, hearing names whispered one by one. Each of us called in turn. Sarah, Jason, Kevin, mine again. Always from the mesquites, never from the open canyon. The trees had become the enemy, pressing close, filling the night with their low, murmured hunger. On the third day, we tried to leave. I was the one who first suggested it. None of us wanted to admit we were spooked, but the unease clung to us like a second skin. We packed fast, shoving tents and coolers into the cars, trying not to look at the trees. That was when Kevin noticed something. His tent, the dirt in front of it. Another spiral, but larger this time, looping wider, curling inward. He cursed and kicked dirt over it, but it didn't feel like enough. When we tried to drive out, the road was washed out from a sudden storm. The ranger station told us we'd have to wait until the water cleared. So we stayed one more night. By then, the voices had grown bolder. They no longer whispered from a distance. They pressed against the thin fabric of our tent, circling, coming from every side. I could hear them breathing between the words, like something old and tired but insistent. When my name came again, the voice had changed. It no longer sounded like my mother. It sounded like me. I lay frozen, my mouth dry, hearing my own voice murmur to me from the other side of the tent wall. "Daniel." The others had their own visitors. I could hear Kevin arguing low with something, his voice rising in panic before he stumbled out of his tent with a flashlight. He shined it on the mesquites, shouting, but the branches only swayed gently as if mocking him. The whisper answered him back, his name stretched into a lullaby. The next morning, Kevin was gone. His tent was still there, his sleeping bag empty, his boots left behind. No footprints leading away, just another spiral carved into the dirt. This one so deep it looked like claws had raked it. Sarah broke down crying. Jason cursed and said he was walking out of the canyon on foot, flood or no flood. I wanted to go with him, but something in me hesitated. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was the thought that leaving the marked spirals behind wouldn't save us. That night the voices were everywhere. They called us over and over until Sarah started answering back, weeping, her voice cracking. She swore she heard her sister's laugh, soft and sweet, drifting from the trees. Jason tried to stop her, but she ran toward the mesquites, arms out like a child. She vanished into the dark, and the trees closed around her. We never saw her again. Jason didn't make it far the next morning. We found him on the overlook, staring into the canyon as if hypnotized. He didn't even turn when we called his name. He just stepped forward and dropped, his body vanishing into the yawning red throat of the canyon. That left me alone, surrounded by whispering mesquites that knew my name better than I did. By then I was too broken to think of escape. I just sat by the fire listening to them call, waiting for the right moment. And when I finally stood and walked toward the trees, I didn't resist. I wanted to see what was waiting in the dark spiral at their roots. I wanted to hear what my own voice would tell me once I stepped inside. I wanted to know who else was whispering along with it. The summer had been hot enough to crack the ground in Possum Kingdom, the kind of heat that stuck to your lungs and made you think twice about stepping out past noon. But the lake was always there, stretched out like a sheet of tarnished glass, wide and calm, and it lured men like me even when it should have warned us away. I had fished that lake since I was a boy, long before the developers built cabins around the coves and people started talking about it like it was some tourist gem instead of a place that belonged to the water and the rocks. I knew the inlets, the drop-offs, the way the catfish lurked deep below, and I knew the silence that came after midnight, when you could sit in your boat and hear your own breath echoing across the stillness. But I didn't know her. Not then. It was late August, a Friday night, the moon fat and yellow above the cliffs. I had anchored just off a narrow cove where the brush line dipped into the water, throwing shadows that made it feel like the lake itself was watching me. My lantern hung low, casting a pale circle on the surface while I worked the line. It was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that presses in on you, reminding you that you are very small and very alone in the middle of so much black water. The only sound was the slow slap of the waves against the aluminum hull. I thought about heading in, but then I saw movement out there on the water, something pale slipping across the surface. At first I thought it was a heron, the way it glided so smooth, but then it stood taller and I saw the shape of a woman. She was walking across the lake as if the water was solid beneath her feet. She was pale in a way that seemed wrong, like milk poured thin, her hair hanging down flat against her face. Her dress, if it could be called that, was the color of old ash, and it trailed behind her without ever dipping into the water. I felt my chest tighten, my breath stall in my throat because there was no sound to her steps, no ripple, nothing but her moving closer with her face turned toward me. My mind scrambled for explanations. Reflection, fatigue, maybe I dozed off, but my eyes didn't lie. She was there, walking toward my boat, her pale feet pressing against the black surface of Possum Kingdom Lake. I couldn't move, not even when she stopped 10 feet away, standing still on the water as if she had anchored herself on some unseen platform. Her head tilted to one side, hair clinging to her cheeks, and though her eyes were lost in shadow, I felt them on me, heavy, cold, stripping me bare. Then she whispered. The sound wasn't carried by air, but it was in my head, soft and sharp at the same time, like glass dragged across my skull. I couldn't tell you what the words were, not in any language I knew, but they were inside me, drilling down. And with every breath I took, I felt the pull of them stronger, tugging at my bones, at the blood in me, at the parts of me that made me myself. I dropped the rod. My lantern swayed and the boat rocked, but none of it mattered because she was still there, whispering. And I was standing now without remembering how I got to my feet. The air smelled like wet earth and something sour, like meat gone bad. My body wasn't my own anymore. I stepped onto the edge of the boat, the water below as black as the mouth of a cave. My heart pounded in my ears, telling me not to, screaming that I was still alive, but her whisper slid deeper and silenced it. I felt the pull and I leaned forward, and the last thing I saw before the lake swallowed me was her face finally lifting, her mouth open in something like a smile, though it was too wide, too sharp, and far too hungry. The water was cold, colder than I'd ever known it, like falling into winter itself. It wrapped around me, filled me, dragged me down. I tried to fight then, too late, my legs kicking, arms clawing, but the black pressed tighter until the world above vanished. In that choking silence, I heard her whisper again, clear this time, though I still couldn't tell what it meant, but I understood. It was not a word meant for men. It was a word that unmade me. I don't remember breathing after that. I don't remember light, only the slow drift, the heavy dark, and shapes moving where no shapes should be. Something brushed my arm, thin and cold, fingers or weeds or worse. I opened my mouth to scream, but only the lake came in, and I knew then I wasn't leaving. Not ever. Because she hadn't come for me alone. She had come because that's what she does. She waits on the water, pale as milk, waiting for a man foolish enough to sit alone under the moon, and she whispers, and he vanishes into the lake. They'll find my boat in the morning. I thought as the black closed in, lantern still swinging, rod left to rust. They'll say I slipped or I drank too much, or maybe they won't say anything at all. But the lake will know. The lake will hold me, and she will keep walking, waiting for the next man who thinks he knows this place, who thinks the water is his to fish. She'll wait and she'll whisper, and she'll take. Because Possum Kingdom Lake belongs to her, and she is always hungry. Highway 32 cuts through the hill country like a scar carved into limestone. A narrow strip of asphalt twisting between ridges and cedar thickets. The sort of place where headlights seem to vanish into the dark just ahead of you, as if swallowed whole. The locals call it the Devil's Backbone, and they say the name comes from the jagged ridge of rock that juts against the horizon. But anyone who's driven it alone at night knows there's more to it than geography. They whisper about the riders, the ones you can't see but can damn well hear. Pounding hooves rushing up behind your car, closing fast, louder and louder until you feel the ground trembling under your tires. And when you look back, there's nothing but dust, curling and writhing in the moonlight like skeletal shapes clawing their way out of the earth. It was early September when Joe Trujillo found himself on that road, a little after midnight. He'd been drinking, not enough to blur his vision but just enough to loosen his better judgment, and he figured taking the backbone would shave 10 minutes off the drive from Canyon Lake to Blanco. The radio was shot in his beat-up Ford, so all he had was the hum of tires and the steady buzz of cicadas outside. The night was hot and still, the kind of heat that clings even when the sun's gone down, and he had the windows rolled halfway down for a little air. The stars were out clear as glass, but the moon was swollen and low, spilling pale light over the ridges. The first sound came soft, faint, like an echo of something far off. Joe thought it was his imagination, the hollow knock of tires catching uneven pavement, but then it grew louder, a distinct cadence, rapid, relentless hooves. He glanced in the rearview mirror, and for a split second he swore he saw shapes moving in the dust. Riders hunched forward, thin and angular, horses with long necks and wild snapping heads, their legs tearing through the earth like pistons. But when he blinked, there was nothing. Just the rolling dirt, lifted in swirls by the wind that hadn't been there a moment before. Joe muttered to himself and gripped the wheel tighter. He pushed the truck faster, engine straining on the incline, and the sound faded. He told himself it was a trick of the road, a vibration, maybe even a loose belt in the engine. But a mile later, on the flat stretch near the Blanco River crossing, the pounding started again, closer this time, surrounding him, as if a whole battalion of horses were charging in the night. His rear view rattled against the windshield, and he dared another look. Dust spiraled in the moonlight, thickening, and in it were shapes no longer vague, no longer questionable. Riders without eyes, without skin, faces like burned bone, mouths open in silent howls. Their spines arched unnaturally as they leaned low over the phantom horses, hands gripping reins made of nothing but shadows, hooves striking sparks against asphalt that left no marks when he passed. Joe screamed, swerved hard, and nearly clipped the guardrail. He floored the gas, pushing the Ford until the needle trembled near red. The pounding stayed with him, steady, merciless, until he crossed out of the ridge and hit the turnoff for Blanco. Then, as suddenly as it began, the sound vanished. The dust fell still. Behind him stretched only empty highway, lit by his fading taillights. Joe didn't stop to think. He didn't stop at all until he pulled into his driveway, shaking so bad he had to sit in the truck until the tremors slowed. He told no one. Not his wife, not his buddies at the bar. He figured it was the tequila. Maybe the heat, maybe his tired mind pulling tricks. But he never drove the backbone again, not once, not even in daylight. But not everyone got away so easy. A week later, 2 teenagers from Wimberley disappeared on that road. Their car was found on the shoulder near a limestone cut, engine still running, headlights burning into the brush. No sign of a struggle, no footprints, no blood. Just the car, dust clinging thick across the windows like it had been whipped up by a storm. Their parents tore through the hills with deputies and dogs, but the boys were never found. Folks said coyotes or runaways, but those who knew the backbone knew better. They said the riders had taken them, claimed them the way they'd claimed men before, all the way back to the Comanche Wars, the cattle drives, even the Confederate patrols that marched these ridges. Ghost riders bound to the backbone like a curse, doomed to hunt in endless fury, snatching souls unlucky enough to hear the pounding. And the strangest part was, if you listened to the old-timers, they all had the same story. My uncle saw them in '62. My cousin's car stalled and he heard them coming, hooves like thunder, until he ran off the road in a panic. My grandmother swore she watched dust rise into skeleton shapes from her porch, twisting and galloping under a blood-red moon. Different times, different witnesses, but always the same thing. Always the riders. Always the dust. One October night, just as the air had begun to cool and the cedar smelled sharp in the breeze, a man named Aaron Price set out on the backbone. He was no stranger to ghost stories, laughed them off as nonsense, the kind of thing people cooked up after a few drinks and a lonely drive. But Aaron was the sort who liked proving people wrong. He loaded his dash with recording gear, a cheap camera, even a shotgun in the passenger seat. Not because he believed, but because he thought it'd be a good story to post online. He drove out there at midnight, parked near the ridge overlook, and waited. At first it was nothing but the creak of his truck cooling and the rustle of leaves. He filmed himself chuckling, saying into the camera that the only ghosts out here were mosquitoes. But then the air shifted. The stillness broke and the dirt along the road began to stir as if something was pacing just out of sight. Aaron frowned, leaned forward, shotgun resting on his knee. The first hoofbeat cracked through the silence like a gunshot. Then another. Then 100 more, rolling toward him like a storm. The camera shook as the truck trembled. He swung it toward the road, and what it caught was chaos. Dust boiling into the night sky, forming into figures pale and twisted. Horses with bones showing through hide that wasn't really there. Riders with empty sockets glowing faint blue. They charged past him, through him, the air turning so cold he could see his breath spill white. His shotgun fell from his lap. His voice, caught on the recording, rose from disbelief to panic, stammering, "No, no, no," before it was cut off in a strangled cry. The next morning, hunters found Aaron's truck still idling by the overlook. The door hung open. His camera lay in the dirt, cracked but not destroyed, still recording static until the battery died. Of Aaron there was no sign. The shotgun was gone too, though no shells were fired. The sheriff's deputies combed the hills for 2 days. They found nothing but boot prints that trailed off into the brush and then simply stopped, as if he'd walked straight into the air. The tape made its way around town, grainy and muffled, and most dismissed it as a hoax, some cheap trick of light and dust. But those who had heard the riders themselves knew the sound, knew the rhythm of the hooves, knew the way the night goes hollow when they come. To this day, if you take the backbone after midnight, you can feel it. That heaviness in the chest, the stillness in the air before the storm breaks. Travelers keep their eyes forward, hands steady on the wheel, telling themselves it's just an old road, just rock and cedar and moonlight. But sooner or later the pounding comes, louder, faster, closer. And when you look back, if you're foolish enough to look back, you'll see the dust rise, curling into shapes that should not exist, galloping with mouths open wide, hungry for someone to fall behind, hungry for someone to claim. The locals say the trick is not to stop, not to swerve, not to give them the chance. Just keep driving no matter what you hear, no matter what you see. Keep driving and maybe they'll let you pass. But if you falter, if you hesitate, if you dare to believe they're not real, the backbone takes another and the ghost riders thunder on, forever chasing, forever hunting, bound to the ridge that gave them life and death alike. The heat of a Texas summer still lingered in the air even as the sun fell behind the pines. The Wilkerson family had driven down from Houston to camp for the weekend at Huntsville State Park, hauling their gear and excitement into the heart of the Sam Houston forest. It was the kind of place where the world felt untouched, where the trees grew thick and close and the lake mirrored the evening sky in shifting bands of orange and gray. The father, Mark, set up the tent while his wife, Angela, laid out food on the picnic table. Their children, Ryan and Emily, 12 and 9, chased each other with flashlights, weaving between the dark trunks, laughing in a way that made the woods seem less oppressive. The campsite sat a little too far from the others, separated by a curve of the lake and a trail that narrowed the deeper it went. Mark had chosen it for the privacy, wanting his family to feel as though they had the entire forest to themselves. As night came, the chorus of crickets rose and the air cooled into something tolerable. They roasted hot dogs, told jokes by the fire, and for a while everything seemed right, almost idyllic. But when the fire burned low and the forest pressed in with its shadows, Angela noticed the silence. The frogs at the lake had gone quiet. The insects stopped their buzzing. Even the occasional rustle of small animals in the brush had stilled. It was as if the woods had drawn in a breath and forgotten how to exhale. Emily pointed first. Her small voice carried a tremor that froze the adults mid-sentence. "What's that?" she whispered, her flashlight beam cutting into the tree line beyond the fire's glow. There, between the shifting shadows of pine needles, a pair of eyes glowed red. Not the faint reflection of an animal, but a steady, unnatural radiance like hot coals staring back at them. The family fell quiet. Mark, always the skeptic, muttered something about a deer caught in the light, though even he didn't sound convinced. But then the eyes blinked. Slowly, deliberately, and when they opened again, they seemed closer. Angela pulled Emily against her side, whispering for Ryan to come sit by the fire. Mark stood, gripping the hatchet he'd brought for splitting kindling, staring into the woods as if his gaze alone could force an explanation to surface. The fire cracked, sparks rising, but it did little to chase back the growing darkness. A sound came from the trees then, a low, dragging scrape like something moving heavy branches across the ground. The red eyes shifted, disappearing and reappearing in a new place as if circling. Ryan gasped. There were more now. 2, then 4, then 6, scattered among the trees, each pair glowing with that same deep red luminescence. They were at different heights, some low to the ground, others higher, as though the things watching them varied in size and shape. Angela whispered, "Mark, we need to go." He shook his head, eyes fixed. "It's just animals." But animals didn't move like that. The eyes didn't sway like deer or blink out when a flashlight beam crossed them. They stayed unblinking until suddenly they didn't, only to ignite again a few feet away. Whatever they weren't running. They were surrounding. The family retreated into the tent when the fire died down, the thin nylon walls suddenly feeling like the only barrier between them and the impossible. Inside, it was suffocating, every sound magnified. The wind through the pines, the creak of branches, the distant ripple of the lake. They huddled together, listening. Emily began to cry softly, muffling her face into Angela's shirt. Ryan clutched the flashlight like a weapon. Then came the footsteps, heavy, deliberate, pressing into the earth outside their tent. The crunch of pine needles, the shifting of dirt. Slow at first, then more of them circling, matching the pace of each other until it sounded like a ring of movement all around them. Mark gripped the hatchet, his breath ragged, sweat breaking across his forehead though the night had grown cold. Angela gasped when something brushed against the tent wall. The fabric bent inward as though pressed by a hand, long fingers dragging slowly across before pulling away. The children froze, Ryan's flashlight beam trembling as he pointed it at the bulging spot. The glow of red seeped faintly through the nylon, the eyes so close that for a moment they seemed inside. Mark shouted a raw sound and burst out of the tent, swinging the hatchet into the night. The others screamed after him, but his figure vanished into the blackness beyond the dying fire pit. They heard him yell again, a mix of anger and fear followed by silence. Minutes dragged. Angela tried calling his name, her voice cracking. No response. The children clung to her, their sobs muffled but sharp in the still air. Then from the woods, Mark's voice came back, but wrong. It was strained, hollow, as if someone were trying to imitate him from a distance. "It's fine," the voice said. "Come out. It's safe now." Angela shook her head violently, whispering for the kids not to move. The imitation came again, closer, repeating the same words. And then, horribly, the words overlapped with themselves. A dozen voices chanting in the same warped tone, all echoing from different spots in the trees. "It's fine, come out. It's safe now." The red eyes multiplied, hundreds of them now, glowing like a field of embers in every direction, closing in. The tent was lit in a dull crimson hue, the air thick with the sound of those impossible voices. Something clawed against the ground, dragging, scraping, circling tighter. Angela squeezed her children, whispering prayers, tears streaming down her face. The zipper began to move. Slow, steady, pulling down as if by invisible hands. The flap of the tent trembled as the eyes pressed closer, and the chanting grew louder, filling every space of the night. The last thing Angela saw before she shut her eyes tight was a figure leaning in, its shape shifting, its face obscured, but the eyes unmistakable, burning, endless red, too many to count. By morning, the campsite was found abandoned. The tent stood shredded and empty, the fire pit cold, the lake still. Rangers searched the woods but found no footprints, no signs of struggle, only strange gouges in the earth and claw marks on the trees, circling the campsite in a perfect ring. Some said the Wilkersons left in the night, running in fear and never looking back. Others whispered darker things, that the forest had taken them, swallowed them whole like it had so many others who vanished without a trace in those endless Texas pines. And still, on certain nights, campers swear that if you're quiet enough near the lake at Huntsville State Park, you can see the glow of red eyes watching from the tree line, waiting, patient, multiplying in the dark. The first thing you notice about lake mineral wells at night is the quiet. Not the normal kind of quiet you get out in the country, but something heavier, like the air itself is pressing against your eardrums, muffling the world. Crickets still chirp in the weeds, cicadas buzz in the trees, and sometimes you hear the splash of a fish breaking the surface of the lake. But none of it seems right. The sounds feel like background noise pumped into a set after the actors have gone home. That's how it felt the night me and two friends camped out on the North Shore. not far from the old trail that used to lead to the abandoned military training grounds. We had driven up from Weatherford, loaded the truck bed with beer and hot dogs and bags of marshmallows, telling ourselves it was going to be just another weekend by the fire. When the sun went down, we staked our tents and got the fire roaring, the kind that throws sparks straight into the sky like fireflies. The lake stretched out black and still, a sheet of glass broken only by the faint silver of moonlight. Across the water, you could just make out the jagged silhouette of the rocks where climbers like to practice in daylight. At night, those cliffs looked more like teeth wide open and waiting to bite. We were halfway through our second round of hot dogs when we heard him, a kid's voice thin and scratchy, drifting in from the darkness beyond the firelight. He didn't walk up all at once, just lingered at the edge of the trees where the pines pressed close to the shoreline. His voice cut through the hum of bugs and the hiss of the fire. "Can I have a marshmallow?" We laughed, all three of us. Out here, nearly midnight, no houses for miles, and some scrawny kid steps out of the trees asking for candy. We figured he was part of another camping group, maybe wandered over from a family site down the way. I pulled a marshmallow from the bag and held it out, and he came closer. Just enough so the glow of the fire lit him up. He was maybe 9 or 10, rail thin, wearing clothes that looked like they belonged to another decade. His jeans were too short for his legs, the cuffs riding high, and his t-shirt had some faded logo I couldn't place, like a gas station patch or a brand that had disappeared years ago. His hair hung straight and greasy across his forehead, but his eyes, that's what stuck with me. They were wide and flat, like he wasn't really seeing us, just staring through. He reached out and took the marshmallow. For a second, everything seemed normal. Then he smiled, at least it should have been a smile. Instead, the skin around his mouth seemed to ripple, sliding like steam over water, and the shape of his face changed. Not all at once, but in pieces, as if his cheekbones melted and shifted, his jaw unhinged, then snapped back, his nose dissolving into the air like smoke off wet wood. We all saw it, and nobody spoke. The fire popped, throwing sparks that made his face look worse, a blur that refused to stay still. The marshmallow dropped from his hand, landing in the dirt with a soft thud. He looked down at it, then back at us, and his voice came again, but it was wrong, layered like a dozen kids were speaking through him all at once. "I'm hungry," my friend David cursed under his breath. Tim reached for the cooler, muttering something about giving him another, but the boy didn't move to pick up the marshmallow on the ground. He just kept standing there, face shifting in the firelight, blurring and reforming, the smoke of him curling into shapes that weren't human. His feet, I realized, weren't touching the dirt at all. They hung a few inches above the ground, toes pointing down. The air went cold. Not the kind of chill you get from a breeze, but deep, cutting, like the temperature had dropped 20 degrees in seconds. My breath came out white, curling in front of me even though it was late summer. The boy, or whatever he was, took a step closer and the fire shrank back, flames guttering low like it was afraid. Behind him, the trees were darker than they should have been, as if the firelight couldn't push its way into them. And then I saw shapes in that blackness, outlines of other children, dozens of them, heads cocked, their eyes like empty pits. They didn't move, didn't blink, just watched from the tree line. The boy's face rippled again, and for a split second I saw what lay beneath. Not skin, but something raw and gray, slick like wet clay, with teeth too long and too many to count. He leaned forward, whispering, though I swear the sound came from everywhere at once, not just his mouth. "You shouldn't be here." That broke us. David kicked sand onto the fire, half putting it out while Tim scrambled for the truck. I didn't look back at the boy as we grabbed our stuff. Didn't want to see what his face was turning into. We piled into the cab, slammed the doors, and tore out of there, headlights swinging wild across the trees. For a second I thought I saw them in the beams, the boy and the others, standing shoulder to shoulder along the tree line watching us go. But when I blinked, the road was empty. We didn't stop until we hit the highway, and even then we didn't talk for a long while. The fire smell clung to us, mixed with something sour and rotten, like lake water left too long in the sun. David finally broke the silence, saying he swore he saw the boy's face in the rearview mirror the whole drive back, flickering in and out like bad reception on an old TV. I never went back to Lake Mineral Wells after that. Tim moved to Houston and David joined the military. We drifted apart, but sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, thinking I hear a child's voice outside my window, thin and scratchy, asking for something sweet. When I look, the glass fogs up from breath that isn't mine. They say the lake used to drown soldiers in training, that kids disappeared off the cliffs or slipped under the water without a splash. Maybe they never left. Maybe they're still hungry, waiting for someone foolish enough to light a fire by the shore and bring marshmallows into the dark. And sometimes I wonder, if I had handed him 2 instead of 1, would I still be here to tell this story? Or would I be standing with the others in the tree line, staring out at the next fire, waiting for the next laugh, the next hand that reaches out, the next person who doesn't realize that the child isn't there at all? In the northeastern corner of Texas, where the land begins to sink into marsh and the pine forests press close against brackish water, there is Caddo Lake. It spreads in a strange, sprawling way, more swamp than lake, its channels winding like black arteries through the cypress knees that rise from the muck. Spanish moss drapes the branches in heavy curtains, and in the quiet hours before dawn, the whole place feels less like part of Texas and more like some forgotten purgatory that stretches on forever. Folks come to fish, to hunt, to drink in solitude, but the locals, the ones who grew up hearing the old stories, they keep a wary distance once the sun goes down, because sometimes when the wind is low and the water flat, there are voices under the surface. A whole choir, some say, humming in low, mournful tones that carry across the swamp. Others swear the voices rise into hymns, old songs half remembered from church pews 100 years gone. They say it's the drowned towns, the villages that were swallowed when the land was flooded, ringing still with ghost hymns. Earl Mather was not a man given to believing in superstition. He was a mechanic out of Jefferson, a stout man with scarred hands, more comfortable with carburetors and rusted transmissions than with scripture. But he liked to fish, and the lake had always given him peace. In October, when the air started to bite at night, he'd load his aluminum boat with tackle and beer and slip it into the water, long before the sun cracked over the horizon. That morning he launched near Uncertain, the little town that clings to the edge of the swamp like something forgotten and unwanted. The fog was so thick he couldn't see 20 feet ahead, only hear the low splash of his oars and the distant cry of a heron. The world was hushed, muffled, as though he had rowed into another country entirely. It was somewhere out near the old cypress stand that he heard it. At first he thought it was the wind in the moss, that faint low murmur that can trick a man's ear when he's alone, but it grew steadier, more organized, rising and falling in unison like human voices bound in a hymn. He stopped rowing, the boat rocking gently, and tilted his head. A chill crept across his shoulders despite his heavy jacket. The sound came from beneath him, down in the black water where the drowned forests lay. A woman's voice, high and clear, lilted out above the rest, singing words he almost knew. Words that snagged in the back of his memory, but would not surface. Then the others rose behind her, a full choir that filled the mist until he could feel it vibrating in his bones. He set his oar down slow and careful, as though any sudden movement might shatter whatever held the sound together. His heart hammered as he reached for the flashlight stowed under his seat. He leaned over the side, beam cutting into the water. All it showed was silt and shadow, the bloated knees of cypress and a few darting minnows. But the singing did not stop. In fact, it seemed to swell as though drawn to his attention, as if the lake itself wanted him to hear. Earl sat frozen for what might have been 5 minutes or an hour. Then just as sudden as it began, the sound cut off. Silence fell, deeper than before, so profound it made his ears ache. A ripple passed under the boat, steady and deliberate, as though something large had drifted beneath. He jerked his light back and forth across the water, his breath quickening. Nothing. The swamp stared back at him, mute and endless. He packed up before sunrise that day and never went fishing again. Word of Earl's story spread quick through town. Most laughed it off, said he'd been drunk, said he'd let the swamp play tricks on him, but a handful nodded with that knowing expression, the one that meant they'd heard things too but had kept quiet. The sheriff said nothing, but he stopped patrolling the lake after dark. And then a month later, 2 college kids from Dallas went missing. They had rented a canoe, hoping to catch pictures of the famous moss-draped cypress at dawn. Their car was found at the boat ramp, their gear scattered, but the canoe never turned up. For days, search parties combed the lake, dogs whining at the water's edge, helicopters chopping overhead. Nothing was found, except some of the volunteers swore that while they dragged the channels with hooks, they heard faint voices under the motor noise. Low, rhythmic singing that seemed to echo up from the silt. By winter, the stories grew darker. A guide out of Karnak claimed he saw pale figures standing knee-deep among the trees one foggy morning, their mouths open, though the sound came from the water, not the air. Another man, a trapper, told of seeing bubbles rise in clusters the size of bathtubs as though whole rooms were exhaling under the mud, the drowned towns. People began whispering again, the ones buried when the river was dammed decades back. Homes, churches, graveyards, all gone under the flood, but maybe not gone enough. It was in March that the real horror unfolded. A group of 4 fishermen, men who knew the lake well, launched out one night to trotline for catfish. Their wives said they left around 9. By sunrise, only the boat was found, drifting near the big cypress bayou, lights still burning, tackle scattered. No sign of the men, not one. When divers went down, they reported strange currents, as if the water twisted beneath them and they surfaced pale, refusing to go back under. One diver broke down shaking and would not explain what he had seen. Rumors spread that the men had been pulled under by pale arms, hands rising from the mud like weeds, but no bodies ever surfaced. Their families still wait. Now those who live near Caddo swear the lake has grown louder. On still nights when the fog presses against the windows, whole hymns drift across the town of uncertain, carried on no wind. Some claim to hear their own names threaded into the verses, as if the drowned voices are calling the living down to join them. Fishermen, once the bravest, now keep to the shore. Even the alligators have been seen leaving channels they once ruled, crawling up onto the banks to sleep away from the water's edge. And when you stand at night listening, it is not just a song you hear, it is hunger. Rising from the black depths, the sound of a congregation that never ended. A church still gathering beneath the swamp. They say if you linger too long, if you lean close and listen too hard, you'll begin to pick out the words. Old hymns, yes, but twisted, their meaning bent into something darker, a worship that asks for sacrifice. And once you understand them, once the words take root in your mind, the voices don't stop when you leave the water. They follow you home, whispering from the pipes, from the sink drains, from the bathtub as you close your eyes. Until one night you wake to the sound of singing not beneath the floorboards but right outside your window, and see the fog pressing close and realize it isn't fog at all but breath, and that the choir of the drowned has finally come for you. The wooden bridge stretched across a narrow arm of the lake like a pale scar in the night. It was an old thing, sagging slightly in the middle, the kind of structure you trusted only because dozens of boot soles had crossed it before yours. At dusk it had seemed almost peaceful, the boards creaking underfoot, the water below reflecting the orange smear of sunset and the faint outlines of the cypress trees leaning over the banks. But night had come quickly in the Fort Worth Nature Center, and with it came the first sound, low, guttural, unmistakable. A howl, deep and ragged, curling up through the gaps in the planks as though the wood itself was exhaling. None of us said a word at first. We froze, flashlights trembling as they cut across the black water. The noise came again, louder, echoing in a way that made the hairs on my arms rise. It wasn't the kind of sound that traveled over distance, thinned out and hollow. It was right there, directly beneath our boots, as though the darkness under the bridge had its own lungs. Then another sound joined it, claws. Long, sharp, dragging across the underside of the bridge. A single scrape, followed by another, deliberate, testing the wood the way a hand tests fruit for ripeness. Someone whispered a curse, and for the first time I thought about how flimsy those planks really were. How little stood between us and the thing that moved in the black water below. We hurried off that bridge faster than we admitted later, half running down the trail, not daring to look back. The woods closed in around us, the cicadas silent, as though the night itself held its breath. By the time we made it back to the gravel parking lot, we laughed too loudly. All of us insisting it was coyotes. Maybe even just the wind shifting the boards. But none of us believed it, and none of us said the truth out loud. We went home with the image of those shadows clinging to us, with the scrape of claws following us into sleep. When we returned the next morning, everything was drenched in golden September sunlight. Birds darted between the trees. Dragonflies shimmered over the lake, and the world seemed harmless again. But when we stepped onto the bridge, the laughter died in our throats. The planks were scarred, deep gouges ripped across the wood. Not the light scuff marks left by boots or bicycle tires, but ragged trenches as though something had clawed its way upward. They ran in uneven lines, some gouges 4 parallel streaks, some 5, each cut as wide as a finger, as deep as a knife. Fresh splinters curled up from the grooves, pale and raw against the weathered boards. The marks stretched nearly the entire length of the bridge, not just in one spot but staggered, erratic, as though several things had stalked the underside all night long, scraping at different boards, searching for a weak point. I knelt down, ran my fingers along one of the grooves, and felt the sting of a splinter burying itself into my skin. The cut was too sharp, too deliberate. No animal in Texas had claws like that. Not here. Not beneath a bridge where the water was no more than 6 feet deep. Someone joked about kids playing a prank, but you could see it in their eyes. They didn't believe that either. We stood there in silence, the heat pressing down on our backs, each of us watching the water below as though something might rise from it any second. The weeks that followed brought stories. A pair of hikers swore they saw shapes moving under the bridge at twilight, darker than the water itself. A fisherman left his line tangled in the reeds, too spooked to reel it in after he said he heard growling from beneath his boat. A park ranger, a man who had worked the trails for 20 years, started leaving the bridge out of his patrols. When asked about it, he just shook his head and muttered that some places remember things. He wouldn't say what things, and we didn't press him. The real change came when the howls returned. They weren't distant coyote cries drifting in from the scrub, but guttural, wet sounds that rose from beneath the boards and traveled through the wood itself, so that when you stood on the bridge you could feel the vibrations in your bones. Sometimes at night the sound carried across the lake, startling campers awake, and those who heard it swore it was more than one voice, that there were many, layered together, all of them straining to be heard. The claw marks grew worse. Each week fresh gouges appeared, newer and deeper, until the boards began to split. Park workers patched them with planks that never seemed to last more than a few nights before being torn apart again. And then there were the disappearances. First a stray dog, last seen sniffing near the banks. Then a college student, his car still parked in the lot, his phone abandoned in his pack. After that, the park closed the trails leading to the bridge. Officially it was for repairs, but no repairs ever happened. The wooden skeleton of it stood untouched, stretching out across the narrow water, sagging further each season. A scar in the landscape no one dared to touch. At night, locals swore they could still hear the howling. On foggy mornings, fishermen whispered of seeing pale shapes moving just beneath the surface, something large enough to ripple the water as it passed, though the lake at that stretch was shallow enough to wade through. Years later, I drove past again, curiosity getting the better of me. The bridge was still there, but the trail to it was overgrown, the signs sun-bleached and half buried in weeds. The water beneath it was black, a mirror that revealed nothing. I walked out to the middle, each step groaning beneath my weight, and for a long moment I stood there in silence, waiting. It was mid-afternoon, the world calm and ordinary, and I felt foolish standing there, an adult chasing the shadows of a night long gone. I leaned over the railing, stared at the reflection of my own face, and that was when I saw it. The water rippled, not from wind but from something just beneath the surface. It was slow, deliberate, as though whatever moved down there was circling. Then the reflection shifted. Not just mine. Another face swam up from the darkness, pale and distorted. Its mouth stretched impossibly wide, teeth jagged, eyes like hollow pits. My breath caught, my body frozen. Every instinct screaming at me to run, but my feet glued to the boards. And then the sound came, rising from below. The same guttural howl I had heard years before, so close I could feel it in the wood beneath me, in the marrow of my bones. The reflection grinned, its mouth widening until the edges split, and the claws came, raking upward through the water, through the shadows, leaving new gouges in the boards at my feet. I didn't stay to see if it broke through. I ran, the sound chasing me down the trail, the echo of claws dragging across wood following me long after I reached the safety of my car. Even now, years later, I can hear it sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn. That scraping, that howl, reminding me that some bridges don't just cross water. Some bridges cross into places we should never step, places that wait beneath us, patient and hungry. The night was thick with heat, even though September had almost bled into October, and the air around Enchanted Rock carried that dry mineral tang that made every breath feel like it came out of stone. Tommy and Laura had driven out from Fredericksburg with a car full of friends, all of them crammed into a borrowed Suburban that smelled like cigarettes and the sweet rot of spilled Coke. They had beer hidden under a tarp in the back and a pair of cheap flashlights, and someone's older brother had whispered about how the granite dome looked unreal under a full moon. Tommy was 17, Laura 16, and they had been circling each other for months in that way kids in small towns do, The kind of tension that made her laugh too hard at his jokes and him linger too long when handing her anything. The idea to climb at night was his, though he barely needed to say it out loud. When they pulled up into the gravel lot, the headlights slicing across the expanse of scrub and shadow, he turned back to her and said, "We're going up there." She didn't argue. The others stayed by the cars, cracking open beers and lighting cigarettes, their voices carrying sharp and thin in the night air. Tommy grabbed the smaller flashlight, handed the other to Laura, and they started across the base trail. The dome loomed, pale and smooth under the moonlight. Not white exactly, but something bleached and ghostly. It looked alive in its stillness, like a whale surfacing in the desert, ancient and waiting. Laura kept close, her sneakers scuffing against granite, and they made their way up the slope. The climb wasn't hard, but it demanded focus, the stone pushing back against their feet with a steady incline that burned their calves. Their beams of light darted over cracks in the rock, patches of scrub clinging where the stone allowed it, and the occasional dark hole that looked like it had no bottom. Halfway up, they killed the flashlights. The moon was so bright the shadows had weight. They could see each other clearly, their faces washed silver, their breath carrying faintly in the cooling night. They didn't talk much, just climbed. There was a point where Tommy looked up and swore the dome didn't end, that it stretched further than it should, higher than he remembered from the day trips with his parents. Laura said she felt the same, like the top was a mirage always receding. They laughed it off, but their voices sounded too soft, muffled, like the rock had swallowed the echoes. When they reached what they thought was the summit, something was wrong. The horizon looked sharper, darker, the stars closer somehow. Tommy checked his watch, a scratched-up Timex his dad had given him, and saw that 2 hours had passed, though it felt like 20 minutes. Laura's lips parted, confusion flashing across her face, and she said, "It doesn't feel right. Time's wrong." He wanted to tell her she was just nervous, that maybe the climb had tricked them, but his stomach had already dropped. The air up there felt thick, pressing in from all sides, though the wind never touched them. They sat for a while trying to make sense of it, but then the quiet began to gnaw. Not silence exactly, there was sound, but it was muted, unnatural. A faint hum seemed to pulse through the granite itself, a vibration under their palms when they rested their hands against the stone. Laura pulled away quick and whispered she wanted to go down. Tommy agreed. The dome no longer looked like it had an end, but they turned, found their footing, and began the descent. The trail was harder to follow than before. They both knew the way, but the rock seemed to shift under their eyes, shadows thickening where there should have been clear granite, patches of scrub blurring in strange ways. They used the flashlights again, but the beams didn't seem to reach far. Only a few feet before fading like fog swallowed the light. Tommy felt panic tighten his throat, but he kept moving, Laura close behind. At one point she said she heard voices, not theirs, distant and broken like radio static, words tumbling just out of reach. He told her not to listen, though he had heard them too. When they finally reached the base, the parking lot looked wrong. The Suburban was still there, but it was coated in a film of dust, the kind that takes years to settle. The paint was dull, tires sagged flat, and the air smelled faintly of mold and something sour. They froze. Tommy's watch said 4:30 in the morning, only 4 hours since they had started, but everything else screamed otherwise. Laura called out for their friends, her voice cracking sharp across the empty lot. A figure moved from the shadows near the mesquite trees and stepped into the pale light. It was Daniel, one of the boys who had been with them, but his hair was white, his skin deeply lined, his posture bent with years. He stared at them, eyes wide with a terror that seemed to come not from seeing them alive, but from something else. His voice was hoarse when he spoke. "It's been 40 years. Tommy shook his head, told him that wasn't possible, but Daniel's face twisted, tears catching in the lines. He pointed to the ground near the cars, where a cluster of folding chairs sat in the dust. The fabric had rotted, metal frames rusted to orange, cans collapsed into themselves. Beside them lay a row of coolers, lids warped, plastic brittle. Daniel said they had waited, all of them, for hours that turned into days, then weeks. Some left, some died. He had stayed longest, though even he eventually gave up and built a life in town, but he never stopped checking. Tonight something had told him to come back, and now here they were, unchanged, like time had refused to touch them. Laura began to cry, soft at first and then harder, the sound raw against the empty night. Tommy tried to argue, to explain that they had only been gone hours, but the world around him screamed the opposite. He felt sick, the ground tilting, the dome looming behind him like it had birthed something monstrous. Daniel kept staring, his hands trembling, repeating that it had been decades, that their parents were long gone, that Fredericksburg wasn't the town they knew anymore. They tried to leave with him, to follow him down the road, but the headlights of his truck barely touched their faces before sputtering out, "Dead?" The air grew thick again, the hum rising from the granite dome, and Daniel stepped back, shaking his head as though he saw something behind them that they could not. His last words before he fled into the darkness were, "You should have never climbed it under the full moon." Tommy turned to Laura, but she was no longer beside him. She stood a few feet away, staring up at the dome, her eyes glassy, her body stiff. When he touched her arm, she whispered that she could hear them again, the voices clearer now, calling her by name. He tried to pull her, tried to drag her back toward the road, but the granite seemed to breathe, the air vibrating so strong it rattled his teeth. Laura slipped free, walking toward the slope with slow, steady steps like she had forgotten him. He called out, his voice breaking, but the dome swallowed the sound. The last thing he saw before the night crushed down around him was her figure moving up the granite, swallowed in silver light, as if she had always belonged to it. Then the hum grew into a roar and his watch hands spun wildly, faster and faster, until the face cracked under the pressure. No one in Fredericksburg ever saw Tommy again, though sometimes, on nights when the moon paints enchanted rock in silver, hikers swear they hear a boy calling for someone named Laura, the sound warped and thin, drifting down from the dome like an echo from a place time has forgotten. The Guadalupe Mountains rise out of the desert like the spine of some ancient beast, their cliffs jagged and wind-worn, their valleys shrouded in a silence that feels heavier than simple absence of sound. On the western side, just beyond Pine Springs, there is a campground that looks ordinary enough during the day, full of hikers, families, and tourists eager to conquer Guadalupe Peak or wander the desert trails. But when the sun drops behind the ridges, shadows lengthen across the limestone, and the air cools with unnatural speed. That campground becomes a place where things don't quite match the world you thought you knew. It was in mid-October when 5 college kids from El Paso decided to spend a weekend there. They weren't reckless city kids. They'd camped before, they knew how to handle rattlesnakes and scorpions, and they respected the land. But respect doesn't matter when the land itself holds something that shouldn't exist. They set up camp late Friday, just a few tents, a cooler full of beer and cheap food, and a lantern they never should have lit. The first night passed with nothing worse than wind sighing through the scrub and the creak of branches overhead. It was on Saturday, after a long hike to the peak and back, that the thing started watching them. At first it was nothing more than a flicker, a wrongness at the edge of their firelight. One of them, a girl named Lila, noticed it while roasting a hot dog. The firelight cast their shadows in a ring, jittering against the rocks and brush, but hers moved wrong. When she lifted her arm, the shadow hesitated a fraction of a second before following. When she shifted her weight, the figure on the rock wall stayed rigid for too long before jerking into place. She didn't mention it right away, thinking she was tired, dehydrated, maybe dizzy from the climb. But later, when she went to the cooler, she caught sight of the shadows again. Every camper's shape moved naturally except one. Hers looked like it was waiting. By midnight, the others noticed too. They laughed about it, made jokes about ghosts and desert spirits, but underneath the laughter there was unease. The shadow grew more blatant. When Jorge lifted his beer, his shadow's arm mirrored him exactly. But beside it, the dark outline of Lila stretched tall and twisted, delayed in its movements as if lagging behind time itself. Then when she sat down, the shadow didn't. It remained standing for a long minute before folding slowly, stiffly, as though bending bones that weren't meant to bend. They should have left then. Any sane person would have packed their gear, stumbled back to their cars, and driven out into the endless Texas night. But fear can paralyze more effectively than chains. They told themselves they were imagining it, that they were too tired, too spooked, and that leaving now would only mean navigating rocky trails by flashlight, risking a broken leg or worse. They stayed. Around 2 in the morning, the fire was little more than glowing coals. The desert was utterly dark, the kind of dark where even your hand inches from your face looks swallowed. Yet somehow, even without light, the shadow remained. They couldn't see the rocks or trees around them, but they could see that shape, darker than dark, tall and thin and wrong, shifting just outside the circle where the fire's glow had once reached. When Mark dared whisper that it was closer now, no one argued. It followed Lila most of all, but it watched the others too. Each time one of them moved, they saw it twitch, mimicking. Sometimes too late, sometimes too soon, as though it couldn't quite sync with their motions but desperately wanted to. And then came the sound. At first a rustle like dry leaves, then a low humming, uneven and faltering. It wasn't wind, not in that still canyon, and it wasn't animal. It was their voices. They heard it clearly. The thing in the dark was mimicking their words, their laughter, repeating fragments of sentences they had spoken hours earlier, but twisted, slurred, strung together like a broken record. Lila's voice saying, "Don't look at it." Jorge's laugh choked and stretched. Mark's voice muttering, "We should go," even though he hadn't spoken yet. Nobody slept. They huddled together until dawn, and with the first gray light spilling over the mountains, the shadows seemed to dissolve, bleeding back into the rocks and sand. They tried to laugh it off in the daylight. Exhaustion made them jittery, their eyes gritty and bloodshot, but none wanted to admit the truth. They said it must have been tricks of the fire, of their nerves. They even considered staying another night. But when Lila went pale and said firmly that she wouldn't spend another hour there, the rest gave in. They packed hurriedly, stuffing tents half folded into bags, leaving trash behind, desperate to put miles between themselves and that place. The highway back toward El Paso is long, empty, and exposed. Mountains drop away into scrub plains, the road stretching like a ribbon through an endless desert. They drove in silence at first, trying to let the normalcy of asphalt and sunlight calm them. But about 40 miles from the park, Jorge glanced in the rearview mirror and swore violently. The others turned and saw it. A shadow running alongside their car, impossibly fast, keeping pace no matter how much Jorge pressed the gas. It didn't run smoothly. It jolted, stumbled, arms swinging too wide, head snapping with every step, but it never fell behind. And worse, it wasn't just running with them, it was mimicking them again. Every time Lila shifted in her seat, it twitched. Every time Mark adjusted his cap, it jerked its head like a grotesque puppet. They drove 100 miles before it vanished, dissolving back into the shimmer of heat off the road. By then, none of them spoke at all. When they finally reached the city and the comfort of lights and people, they convinced themselves they'd left it behind in the desert. For a few weeks, life returned to normal. But then things began again, quietly. A second shadow at night in their bedrooms, not aligned with lamps or windows. A voice on the phone repeating words they hadn't said yet. A reflection in the TV screen moving when they sat perfectly still. They stopped answering each other's calls, stopped meeting in person. Each was alone with it now, and that was worse. The skinwalker doesn't just mimic, it learns. And once it has your shadow, your voice, your shape, there's only one ending it wants. The last anyone heard from Lila was a voicemail full of static, her own voice sobbing in the background while another version of her voice laughed over it, loud and broken. The others disappeared one by one. Police reports filed, families frantic, but no bodies ever found. Just empty rooms where the lights burned out, windows left open, and in the dust on the floors, footprints that didn't match the missing. Too long, too thin, as if something had learned to walk but still hadn't figured out how. The caves along the Colorado River were not meant for people. That thought nagged at Miranda from the moment she switched off her flashlight and listened to the soundless dark pressing in. She and the three others, Caleb, her brother, and two friends from college, had driven the 4 hours down winding Texas highways to Colorado Bend State Park on a dare more than anything else. Caleb had heard stories, whispered secondhand rumors from other cavers, about a chamber locals called the Whisper Caves. Nobody agreed where the entrance was, but everyone agreed what happened inside. Voices. Not just voices, but the exact words you tried hardest not to say out loud, spoken back to you in the dark. They had parked at the trailhead just before dusk, the September heat hanging heavy even as the sun slid behind the limestone hills. By the time they reached the cave mouth, a ragged hole halfway up a rocky slope, the air had cooled, but the cicadas still droned like 1,000 tiny engines. Miranda stood at the edge and peered in. The cave swallowed the beam of her headlamp after only a few yards. She felt the way you do before diving into black water, your body telling you no even as your friends egg you on. Caleb was already tightening the straps on his helmet, grinning. The tunnels were low at first, forcing them to crawl, limestone scraping their elbows, packs snagging on protruding rock. Then abruptly, the passage widened into a gallery with a ceiling lost in shadows. Their lights picked out mineral formations that looked like melted wax. Water dripped somewhere, steady as a heartbeat. They moved deeper, marking the walls with fluorescent tape, though Miranda doubted the little scraps would matter if something really went wrong. The first whisper came as they entered a narrow choke point. Miranda froze, sure she had imagined it. It was faint, like the soft hiss of wind through dry grass, but unmistakably syllables. She swung her headlamp toward Caleb, but he was pushing ahead, oblivious. Then the whisper came again, and this time she caught the words. Her own voice impossibly saying, "You're going to get stuck here." Her lungs shrank against her ribs. She hadn't spoken, but the voice was hers. She tried to laugh it off when they regrouped in a larger chamber. Nobody else had heard anything or admitted to it. But she noticed the way Jake, one of Caleb's friends, kept glancing over his shoulder. His jaw was tight, his lamp beam jittery. A trick of the acoustics, Miranda told herself. Nothing more. The caves played with sound, everyone knew that. But when the group fell silent, she swore she could hear something still speaking under their breathing. Layered and low, threading through the stone. Hours seemed to pass. They squeezed through a slot barely wide enough for their shoulders, emerging into a chamber that reeked of damp earth. That was when Jake lost it. He swung around, helmet scraping the wall, and yelled, "Shut up!" I didn't say it, I didn't. His voice echoed raggedly, then the silence returned, deeper than before. Caleb tried to calm him, but Jake shoved him away. "It knows," Jake hissed, eyes wild. "It said it back to me." No one pressed him, but the unease settled thick in their throats. They decided to turn back. Yet the tunnels seemed unfamiliar now, the markings on the walls fewer than there should have been. The whispers followed, louder, overlapping, voices none of them had spoken aloud but had thought in secret. Miranda heard her own memory replayed, the night she had wished her mother dead during one of their fights. Word for word, the exact phrasing repeated in the dark with relish. She stumbled, scraping her palms on jagged stone. Caleb caught her arm, but his own face was pale, sweat dripping. He wasn't immune either. They tried to hurry, but every passage looked the same, limestone shimmering wetly in their lamps. Their batteries were draining, the beams weaker with each minute. The voices grew bolder. Jake's father's voice, harsh and slurred, accusing. A girl's voice whispering Caleb's worst fear. The one about drowning in tight spaces, lungs filling with water. Even Sam, the quietest of the four, started muttering prayers under his breath as if to drown out the chorus. But the cave had learned their cadence, mocking him with the same prayers back in a cracked, childlike voice. They found themselves circling, returning to the same stalagmite they had passed before. Panic chewed at the group. Jake bolted down a side tunnel, his light bobbing. The others shouted after him, but the cave swallowed his figure. A second later, a scream tore through the stone, abrupt and final. Then silence except for the whispers resuming, louder, as though feeding. Sam wanted to go after him, but Caleb held him back. The tunnel Jake had taken was already collapsing in darkness, the stone seeming to pulse closer. They stumbled the other way, half crawling, half sliding. Miranda's lamp sputtered, then steadied weakly. She kept her eyes on Caleb's back, afraid to look at the walls where the shadows seemed to ripple like water. She could swear something moved just beyond the edge of her light, lips shaping words soundlessly. When they finally burst out into night air, it was as sudden as waking from a nightmare. The cicadas were gone. The stars hung cold and sharp over the park, the river whispering far below. They ripped off their helmets and gulped the air. Jake was gone. No one suggested going back for him. They stood in silence, each unwilling to admit what they had heard. The only sound was the faintest murmur drifting from the cave mouth, as if it exhaled their words back to them. They left before sunrise, packs half full, tape still clinging to their belts. The drive back was quiet, the highways empty, dawn bleeding red over the scrub and mesquite. Miranda stared out the window, listening to the phantom echo in her ears. She realized the voices hadn't stopped. Even now, miles from the park, she could hear her own words, the ones she had never said aloud but had thought in moments of weakness, whispered back in the exact tone of her own voice. She pressed her palms to her ears, but it was inside her, not outside. And when she glanced at Caleb, she saw him twitching, lips moving in silent argument with something only he could hear. Neither of them spoke. The whispers would only repeat it. The first time anyone saw it was on a warm October night when the air hung heavy with the smell of cedar and mesquite. and the campers along the Frio River had already settled into their tents. Garner State Park was alive with its usual nocturnal chorus, cicadas and frogs working in concert, the slow ripple of the river licking against limestone banks. A group of college kids from San Antonio had driven out for the weekend, laughing and drinking cheap beer until the embers of their fire had turned to red eyes staring up from the pit. That was when the dog appeared, black as wet asphalt, standing just beyond the ring of firelight. No one heard it approach. It was simply there, watching. At first they thought it belonged to someone in another campsite, a stray mutt drawn by the smell of hot dogs and spilled chili. Its fur was short and ragged like burnt cloth, and its eyes reflected the fire with a color too pale to be brown, too bright to be natural. It didn't bark, didn't whine, didn't wag its tail. It stood still, head lowered as though waiting for an invitation. One of the boys tossed it a crust of bread. The dog didn't move to catch it, didn't even flinch when it hit the ground at its feet. It stayed rooted, breathing slow, so quiet you could almost believe it wasn't breathing at all. Then, when someone finally stood and waved their arms to shoo it away, it slipped back into the trees without a sound, as if it had melted into the dark. By morning, they thought nothing of it. They packed their gear, joking about ghost dogs, and headed home. But other campers told the same story. Families with children, hunters with rifles, lovers tucked into sleeping bags near the river's edge. All had seen the black dog. Always at night, always watching. It followed some, padding along the gravel trails just beyond the swing of flashlight beams. It left no tracks. Park rangers dismissed the stories as superstition, the way they dismissed most campfire talk, but the whispers spread. People said the dog was there before the park was even fenced in, before cabins were built, before the dance pavilion lit up summer nights. It belonged to the land, they said, and it was waiting for something. The McAllister family was camping in early March when they first saw it. The father, Carl, was a man who didn't believe in stories. He'd been raised in Uvalde County, knew every snake and every coyote, knew the difference between a panther's scream and a screech owl's call. He laughed when his daughter Maggie pointed out the black dog near the water's edge just after sundown. "It's just a stray," he said, and went back to rigging a fishing pole. But the dog followed them the entire evening. When Maggie skipped rocks, it stood behind her in the trees. When Carl cast his line into the slow-moving river, it stood across the water, watching. When his wife unzipped the tent to crawl inside, it was there by the picnic table, silent and patient. Even the fire didn't scare it away. Its pale eyes never left them. By dawn, Carl saw something he never could explain. He woke early, restless, and went outside while the others slept. The sun was just breaking the horizon, a smear of red and orange bleeding across the hills. And there, at the edge of their campsite, stood the dog. But it wasn't the same size anymore. It had grown in the night, taller than a man, its body stretching upward like a shadow pulled from the earth. Its fur was no longer ragged, but sleek and blacker than anything Carl had ever seen, so dark it seemed to swallow the morning light. It blocked out the rising sun, a wall of darkness in the shape of a beast. Carl froze where he stood, the cool dawn air turning to ice in his chest. The thing opened its mouth wider than any natural jaw, and the sound that came out was not a growl, not a bark, but something like a howl stretched through metal, a sound that bent the air itself. Carl stumbled backward, fell, scrambled to his feet. By the time he looked again, the thing was gone, leaving only the river glinting cold and empty under the new sun. He never told his family what he saw, but after that trip, Carl refused to camp in Garner again. Maggie grew older and told the story anyway, swearing her father had changed after that morning. He drank more. He woke in the night screaming. Sometimes he stood in the yard and stared west toward the hills, muttering that the dog was still waiting. By the time he died, heart failure at 52, Maggie swore he'd been chased into the grave by something no one else could see. The dog kept appearing. Hikers on the trails saw it pacing ahead of them, always out of reach. Lovers on blankets saw it circle closer until they packed up in silence, their passion gone cold. A fisherman swore he saw it walk across the river itself, its body gliding over the water like smoke. Some said it was the devil's hound. Others said it was the ghost of a murdered drifter buried under the pecan trees by the old pavilion. But the oldest folks in Leakey whispered that it was older than all of that. A curse bound to the land before fences, before roads, before men even gave the Frio its name. No one ever saw it attack. It didn't need to. It waited, it grew, By dawn it was always taller, always darker, its body stretching into something that blocked out the light itself. And if you stood too close when the sun rose, if you let yourself fall under its shadow, you might never come back the same. Some who did were hollow-eyed afterward, voices cracking when they tried to explain. Some simply vanished. Cars left at trailheads were never reclaimed. Tents collapsed around cold ashes with no campers returning. The rangers kept no record of these things, but the towns nearby knew. They locked their doors at night and told their children not to look too long at the black dog if they saw it, not to follow, not to listen. But the dog always finds someone. It always follows. And when the sun rises over Garner State Park, there is always a shadow waiting to blot it out. The fog rolled over Lake Somerville in a low, clinging sheet, crawling across the water like something alive. It was the kind of mist that swallowed light whole, leaving lanterns and flashlights muted, halos in a void that stretched forever. People said the fog came heavier here than anywhere else in Burleson County, that the lake breathed it out like a sleeping giant, exhaling a warning. Most folks ignored it, chalked it up to humidity and bad timing. But the regulars, the ones who came back to the campgrounds year after year, would shake their heads and mutter, "Never camp near the shore when the mist is that thick." It was a rule, though nobody liked to explain why. Tom and Nancy Brewer didn't know the rule. They had driven down from College Station with their teenage son Ethan and his two buddies from school. The idea was simple enough: an easy Friday night by the water, a few beers for the parents, marshmallows, and bad guitar for the boys. The campsite they picked was perfect. A short walk to the lake, soft ground for the tents, no other campers nearby. The ranger at the gate had said something about the mist rolling in heavier than usual, but Tom laughed it off, saying he'd fished in fog thick as pea soup back in Michigan. He didn't know that Texas mist was a different creature altogether, thick but restless, shifting with a purpose, carrying things that didn't belong. By the time darkness fell, the fog was already creeping out of the water. The boys dared each other to walk down to the edge, the shoreline a soft smear of shadow, but none went past the firelight. It was Ethan who first noticed the boy. He'd been leaning back in his camp chair, strumming the guitar awkwardly, when his eye caught something pale moving near the water. At first he thought it was just the mist, a trick of shadows, but when it shifted again, it had shape. It was a boy, maybe 12 or 13, hair slick against his skull, skin so pale it almost reflected the firelight. He stood waist-deep in the water, staring silently at the tents pitched behind the fire. Ethan blinked and looked away, embarrassed, half thinking his mind had wandered, but when he looked back, the boy was still there. And the boy was pointing. Not at Ethan, not at the fire, but at the tents. Ethan nudged his friend Connor, who turned and immediately went pale. "Do you see that?" Ethan whispered. Connor nodded, muttering something under his breath. The third boy, Mason, laughed it off, saying it was just some dumb local kid trying to scare campers. He whistled toward the figure and shouted, "Hey, creep, you lost or something?" The boy in the water didn't move. His arm stayed raised, finger pointing at the tents. Mason picked up a stick and hurled it into the lake, but it only splashed through mist and water. The boy didn't flinch. The parents hadn't noticed. Tom was working on his third beer. Nancy was fussing over the marshmallows. When the boys tried to explain, pointing to the water, both adults squinted into the fog and saw nothing. "It's the mist," Nancy said. "Makes you see things. Don't wind each other up." But Ethan knew what he had seen. He didn't like the way the boy's arm never wavered, the finger aimed like an accusation. He didn't like the way the fog seemed to thicken only around the tents, curling low around the nylon like smoke around a grave. When they crawled into their sleeping bags later, the sound of the lake carried unnaturally close. The slap of water against rocks, the hollow echo of something moving just beneath the surface. Ethan tried to convince himself it was fish, maybe a big one chasing minnows, but the rhythm was too deliberate. He could hear Connor's shallow breathing in the tent beside his, the occasional nervous cough from Mason. The fog pressed in against the thin nylon walls, blotting out the moonlight. And for a long time, Ethan lay awake, listening. That was when he heard it, a soft slap, 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 followed by the squelch of wet feet dragging over mud. It circled the tent slowly, and with every pass, Ethan's skin prickled colder. Then came the sound of fingers against nylon, a wet hand dragging across the tent wall. He pressed himself flat and tried not to breathe. At exactly 3 a.m, Mason screamed. His tent collapsed in on him as if something had dropped from above. The aluminum poles snapped with a sharp crack, the nylon folding over him like a coffin lid. Ethan and Connor scrambled out of their tents, hearts hammering. But when they reached Mason, he was gone. Not under the collapsed nylon, not thrashing in his sleeping bag. Gone. Only the twisted frame of the tent remained, dripping wet as though it had been hauled from the lake. The fog was so thick now they couldn't see more than a foot ahead. But through it, Ethan thought he saw the boy again, standing at the edge of the fire pit, finger raised, pointing again. This time it wasn't at the tents. It was at Ethan. Connor bolted, sprinting blindly into the mist. Ethan tried to follow, but the fog swallowed his friend in seconds. Nancy was screaming Tom's name. Tom was shouting back, but the voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Ethan turned back to where the boy had been and found only the pale outline of wet footprints leading back toward the water. He followed without meaning to, like a string had been tied around his chest and was pulling him forward. His feet sank into the mud at the shoreline, the lake breathing out mist in waves, and there he saw Mason, or what was left of him. The body floated just beyond the reeds, face pale and bloated, mouth open as though he had screamed until the water claimed him. And next to him the boy stood again, not pointing now but beckoning, his eyes flat and black as the lake behind him. Ethan stumbled backward, slipping in the mud, and ran. He didn't stop until the fog thinned enough for him to see the beam of a ranger's flashlight. By dawn they had found Nancy wandering near the boat ramp, half delirious, calling Ethan's name. Tom was never found. Neither was Connor. Mason's body surfaced 3 days later, snagged on a fisherman's line. The official story was an accident. Kids gone too close to the water at night, a father lost trying to save them. But Ethan never forgot the boy. The way he had risen from the water, silent and still, pointing at tents until one fell. Years later, he still wakes some nights drenched in sweat, hearing the slap of wet feet circling his bed, the drag of a finger across the wall, and sometimes when he dares to camp again, far from Lake Somerville, he swears he sees mist creeping low around the tents, and in the corner of his vision, a pale arm rising from the dark, finger raised, waiting for one to fall. The first time I ever set foot in Bastrop State Park after the fires, the air still smelled faintly of char, though the flames had been gone for years. Blackened trunks jutted into the sky like teeth, skeletal reminders of the inferno that had ripped through central Texas and left the land scarred. New growth was there, sure, sprigs of green pushing up defiantly from the ash, but it felt wrong, like the earth itself was holding its breath. Locals said the forest never fully came back, that something shifted in the soil, in the roots, in the silence that lay between the surviving trees. But it wasn't silent at night, at least not if you listened. Campers whispered about screams carried on the wind, sounds like tortured voices buried in bark. And they swore that when the moon was high, the trunks twisted, their charred husks groaning as if something inside was still burning. I didn't come to Bastrop for ghost stories. I came because I was tired of city noise, tired of the constant hum of Austin traffic, and I wanted a place where I could sit with myself. A tent, a cooler, a stack of beer, that was my plan. No phone, no company, just me in the woods. It was late September when I pulled into the campsite, the air still hot and sticky in the way Texas refuses to surrender summer. The pines that remained loomed dark and uneven, some alive, some nothing more than charred sticks clawing at the evening sky. My campsite sat at the edge of a clearing where the fire had chewed the hardest. The ground was patchy, a mix of new grass and old black soil. As I set up my tent, I could hear the distant rustle of wind through the needles, and there was something hollow about it, like the sound passed through a throat instead of branches. The park ranger who checked me in had been one of those leathery old Texans who never smiled. He'd looked at me too long, his sunburned face unreadable, and said, "Don't go wandering past the fire line after dark. Folks get turned around out there. Easy to lose the trail." His tone wasn't a warning so much as a statement of fact, like telling me the temperature. Still, the words stuck with me, repeating in my head as the light drained from the sky. By the time the sun dipped low, the forest looked like a graveyard. Blackened pines cast shadows that stretched and bent across the clearing, long fingers reaching toward my tent. I made a fire in the pit, cracked open a beer, and tried to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every so often, the air carried a sound that didn't fit, the snap of wood deep in the trees, a whistle that rose and fell in no natural rhythm. a faint wail that died before I could decide if it was real. The fire kept me anchored. I fed it until the flames were tall and restless, dancing against the darkness. But the trees stood darker still, their burned bark glistening like wet skin in the firelight. I tried to laugh it off. I told myself it was just coyotes or the wind. But sometime around midnight, when I was half dozing in my camp chair, the sound came sharp and clear, tearing through the night. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It was a scream, long, ragged, and human, echoing through the pines as if carried by every scorched trunk in the park. I bolted upright, the beer can tipping in the dirt. My first thought was that someone was in trouble, maybe a hiker stranded past dark. I grabbed my flashlight and stood at the tree line, beam cutting into the endless rows of burned pines. The scream had already faded, but in its place came a low groan, wood straining against itself as though the trees were shifting, trying to move. I should have stayed put. That would have been the smart thing, but something in me needed to know. I stepped past the fire line, the soil crunching under my boots, and aimed the light ahead. The trunks gleamed black, jagged edges catching the beam like teeth. My breath sounded too loud, my footsteps even louder, and then without warning the sound returned, but closer this time, impossibly close. The scream poured out of a tree not 10 feet in front of me, ripping through the bark in a voice that wasn't quite human, wasn't quite wood, but something caught in between. My flashlight shook as I raised it, and I swear on everything I saw the trunk twist. The charred bark split in a slow, deliberate way, like a mouth opening, and inside was nothing but blackness. The scream didn't stop. It rattled through me, pressing against my chest, vibrating my teeth. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the light. And when I turned to run, I saw other trunks twitching, groaning, their surfaces bending as though something inside pressed to get out. I sprinted back to camp, the beam bouncing wildly, shadows leaping in every direction. By the time I burst into the clearing, the fire had nearly died. Nothing but glowing coals left. The tent stood there in the dark like a waiting mouth. My lungs heaved, my head spun, and when I glanced back, the trees looked still again, just black silhouettes against the faint moonlight. I told myself I imagined it. Shock, exhaustion, maybe the beer. I shoved more wood onto the fire, coaxed the flames high, and sat there gripping the flashlight until dawn painted the sky gray. The ranger didn't say much when I checked out the next morning, but he gave me that same long stare. I started to tell him what I'd heard, what I thought I'd seen, but the words died in my throat. He just handed me my receipt and muttered, "Those trees, remember?" Then he turned away like the conversation was over. I didn't go back. I don't plan to, but sometimes at night, even miles away in the city, I swear I can hear it again. The scream carried on the wind a voice that doesn't belong to the living, and I wonder if those twisted trunks, still standing black and broken in Bastrop, are waiting for the next fool to camp too close, the next fool to listen too hard, until the screaming pines decide to answer back. The night air in McKinney Falls carried the smell of wet cedar and river silt, the kind of smell that clings to your clothes long after the fire's gone out. The state park was mostly empty by late October, just a few scattered tents and a couple of RVs glowing faintly from within. A man named Carl Hughes had set up camp by the water, far from the trailheads where families tended to cluster. He liked the solitude, the silence broken only by cicadas and the distant rush of the falls. After a long day of hiking, he crouched down at the river's edge, cupped his hands into the current and splashed the cold water onto his face. When he lifted his head, droplets sliding down his cheeks, he froze. The reflection in the water was his face, but it wasn't his face. The eyes were nothing but smooth, dark sockets, and the mouth was stretched into a grin so wide it looked carved with a knife. He jerked back and lost his balance, landing hard on the damp bank. His breath came fast, his ears filling with the steady gurgle of the river. He scrambled to his knees and leaned over again, searching for some logical answer, but the reflection had returned to normal. His own face stared back, pale and frightened, eyes wide and ordinary, mouth closed and trembling. He stayed there for a long time, knees in the mud, convincing himself it was a trick of exhaustion, maybe the shadows of branches bending across the water. By the time he crawled back into his tent, he had managed to force the memory into something half-believed, the way a child convinces himself the monster at the foot of the bed is just a coat on a chair. But the night did not let him forget. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt the image returning. the eyeless grin staring from behind his lids as though the water had caught something that wasn't supposed to be seen. Around midnight, he heard footsteps outside his tent. Slow, deliberate steps crunching in the gravel and dead leaves, circling once, then again, and then stopping at the zipper. He held his breath, knife in hand, straining his ears for the rasp of the zipper teeth. Nothing came, and after several minutes the steps moved away toward the water. He tried to tell himself it was a deer, or maybe one of the other campers wandering drunk, but something inside him knew better. Deer didn't stop and breathe at your tent flap. Drunks didn't move with such patience, such quiet calculation. In the morning, he found the riverbank around his camp pressed with barefoot tracks. They were his size, his shape, but the toes were too long, curling like pale worms into the mud. He packed up by noon, unable to shake the sense that something was waiting for him down by the water. But leaving proved more difficult than he thought. The trails he knew by heart seemed twisted. He would follow a marked path only to end up back at the same clearing where his tent had stood. Twice he thought he caught a glimpse of himself moving ahead through the cedar brush. Same clothes, same pack, vanishing between the trees before he could shout. Each time he ran after it, his chest burning with panic, but found only empty trails in the thick hush of the forest. When he finally stumbled back to the river, exhausted and cursing, the water seemed darker than before, like oil catching no light. By the second night, he had lost track of his own logic. He told himself to keep the fire burning, to keep the shadows at bay, but he kept turning toward the water without meaning to, like it was pulling at the corner of his vision. Once he swore he saw the surface ripple as though something had climbed out, dripping and pale, then leaving no sign except the smell of rot in the air. The laughter came not long after, soft at first like a child muffling a giggle in the dark, then louder, a chorus of his own voice twisted into glee. He clamped his hands over his ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't outside, it was inside, curling along his skull like roots. He broke down finally at dawn. His food was gone, his map useless, and his phone had long since died. He stumbled to the river, desperate to drink, to anchor himself to something solid and real. The water was still, impossibly still, and when he leaned over, he saw himself again, grinning, eyeless, patient. This time the reflection didn't wait for him to blink. It lifted its hand in unison with his, but where his fingers trembled, the reflections moved with calm certainty. Then it did something different. It pressed its hand against the underside of the water's surface. The ripples spread out in rings, but on Carl's side the water remained smooth as glass. He screamed and staggered back, but the reflection stayed. Palm flat against the barrier, mouth splitting wider until the skin tore at the corners, exposing teeth that weren't shaped like human teeth anymore. They were too long, too sharp, crowding the jaw like shards of bone. By the third night, no one at the park saw him anymore. His campsite was empty except for a torn tent, shredded as though something had raked it from the inside. His backpack lay open, everything inside soaked with river water. Rangers searched for him for weeks, combing the limestone trails, the cedar breaks, the shallow pools beneath the falls, but no body was ever found. Some said he must have slipped, drowned, and been swept downstream, though the river that year was barely waist-high in most places. Others muttered that McKinney Falls had always been strange, older than the towns around it, older than the names carved into the limestone. Locals said if you camped there alone and wash your face at night, you might see yourself in the water smiling without eyes. And if you do, it's already too late. Those who swear by it say the reflection isn't just an image. They say it's patient and it waits for the moment when you can't look away. When you finally lean close enough, it doesn't pull you in. It climbs out, and once it has, there's no telling which side of the water you'll wake up on. The desert around Terlingua is the kind of place that makes silence feel alive. By day, the sun flattens everything into shimmering heat, and by night, the stars look so sharp you could cut your hand on them. People come out here for the quiet, for the isolation, for the strangeness of a ghost town at the edge of Big Bend where adobe walls crumble into dust and rusted trucks sit abandoned under the mesquite. Some come for the ghosts too, though no one admits it out loud. Jacob, Melissa, and two of their friends had rolled into Terlingua late on a Friday, hauling coolers of beer and folding chairs, a couple of tents, and the kind of restless energy that only comes from trying to escape city life. They set up camp on the outskirts, near a cluster of ruins where half-fallen stone chimneys stood against the fading horizon like broken teeth. The desert was already cooling, the sun giving way to a thick indigo that spread slowly, swallowing the ridges and dry washes. They built a fire in a pit of rocks and drank until the chill settled into their bones. The others joked about coyotes and mountain lions, but Jacob kept glancing at the edges of the firelight. There was a quality to the darkness in Terlingua he hadn't felt anywhere else. It wasn't the usual nothingness of night. It felt occupied. Melissa was the first to point it out. She had been leaning back in her chair, staring into the fire when she frowned and lifted her chin toward the adobe wall a few yards away. "Look at that," she said. They turned and saw the shadows. The fire threw their silhouettes long and thin against the wall, but there were more than four. Another figure stretched high and crooked, its arms impossibly long, its head bent at an angle that none of theirs matched. At first, Jacob told himself it was the trick of flame and stone. Shadows bend and warp on uneven surfaces, but then the shape shifted, peeling slightly away from the wall as if it were independent of them, not tethered to flesh at all. "Jesus," Eric muttered. "That's not us," no one laughed. The figure twitched. It raised one of those thin arms in a slow wave, a deliberate gesture. The desert seemed to hold its breath. The only sound was the wood crackling, sharp in the silence. Melissa let out a strained laugh and waved back. "There," she said, her voice brittle. "Now we're even." The shadow waved again. They killed the fire early that night, retreating into their tents with the kind of nervous chatter people use to keep fear at bay. Jacob lay awake, listening to the thin nylon shiver with every faint gust. The ground felt colder than it should, as though the desert itself were leaching warmth from his body. Somewhere outside, gravel crunched, but not in the light, scampering way of an animal. These were slow, dragging steps. He held his breath, eyes wide, until they stopped. He waited for the zipper on the tent to move, but it never did. Eventually, he fell into a shallow, restless sleep. Morning didn't make things better. The air was clear and the sky endless, but Jacob noticed something wrong with the ground near the ruins. In the dirt, just at the edge of where their fire had burned, there were impressions. Long, narrow prints, deeper than any shoe would make, trailing off into the brush. He didn't mention them to the others. That evening, after a day of hiking the desert trails, they built another fire. No one spoke about the shadow, but each of them kept glancing toward the wall as the flames grew. Sure enough, as night deepened, the extra silhouette slid back into place. This time it didn't just wave. It beckoned. It lifted its elongated arm and curled its fingers, slow and patient, summoning them. Melissa whispered, "Do you see that?" "We all see it," Eric snapped, his voice shaking. The shadow crooked its head as if amused. Then it stepped sideways out of the wall. The fire didn't flicker. Their own shadows didn't change. Only the extra one detached, walking stiffly across the dirt toward the brush. It paused, raised its hand again, and beckoned once more before melting into the darkness beyond the reach of the firelight. None of them followed. Not that night. The next morning, Eric was gone. His tent stood open, his sleeping bag empty, his pack missing. They searched the ridges and gullies until the sun burned the skin off their necks, shouting his name into the unforgiving emptiness. No answer came, just the distant echo of their own voices. When night fell again, only 3 shadows leaned against the wall. The fourth one, stretched tall and bent at the neck, waved at them from where the brush began. Melissa broke first. She screamed at it, throwing rocks and curses, but the shadow didn't flinch. It only waved, slow and steady. When she turned to Jacob and the other friend, her eyes were wet and her face pale. "It's him," she whispered. "It has Eric, don't you see?" Jacob shook his head, but his stomach twisted with something close to belief. The figure did look more like Eric now, though wrong in every angle, as though wearing his form like an ill-fitting suit. That night, Melissa left. Jacob heard her unzip the tent, her footsteps fading. He wanted to call out, but the weight in his chest kept him silent. When morning came, there were only 2 tents. Hers was empty, the fabric flapping in the dry wind. The second friend refused to stay. They packed up fast, refusing to look at the wall, refusing to glance into the brush where something watched with patient stillness. He left Jacob alone in the ruins by sundown, dust rising behind his truck until there was only silence again. Jacob thought about leaving too. But when night came and he sat by the last small fire, too drained to move, the wall filled with shadows once more. His own, Melissa's, Eric's, the friends, and one more, tall and bent, waving endlessly. He stayed frozen until dawn, when the fire burned out and the desert wind covered the prints in sand. He knew he should leave, but by then it didn't matter. He felt it standing just behind him, blotting out the rising sun, long fingers stretching for his shoulder. When they found the camp weeks later, all 4 tents stood in a half circle around a ring of cold ash. Inside each one, sleeping bags lay arranged neatly as though waiting for their owners to return. And against the crumbling wall of adobe, 5 shadows stretched across the stone in the noonday sun. Even though there was nothing in front of it to cast them, one of the shadows was waving. The heat never quite leaves East Texas, not even after the sun sinks below the pine tops and the night settles like a damp wool blanket. At Sam Rayburn Reservoir, the air carries that heavy mix of cedar, gasoline from outboard motors, and the faint metallic tang of fish blood washed into the shallows. It was the last weekend in August, the kind of night when grown men sit in their aluminum boats with beers sweating in their hands, rods propped against coolers and laughter trying to drown out the silence of water. So still it seems to listen. There were 4 of them that night. Locals, all of them, though none would claim to be true lake rats. They worked in Lufkin or Nacogdoches during the week, and came down to the water when they needed to remember they weren't trapped in a cycle of time cards and flat tires. Billy, who owned the boat, was the kind of man who smiled too wide when the talk turned to hunting stories. His cousin Shane had the kind of laugh that always sounded like a dare. The others were Jesse and Mark, quieter men, steady drinkers who knew the difference between a gar rolling near the surface and something else breaking the water. They had settled near one of the inlets, lantern hung low on a pole to draw in the bait fish, their lines cutting pale angles into the black water. The frogs had gone silent about an hour earlier, and no one had noticed until Jesse asked why it felt so dead out there. He said it casually, but it sat on them all like the first cold draft sneaking into a warm house. The lantern hissed, moths beating themselves into its glow. Billy swatted one away and muttered that it was nothing, just weather changing, probably a storm brewing over the lake. That was when Shane leaned forward, peering out past the halo of their light. "Y'all see that?" His voice was low, strained, as if he were afraid of being overheard. The others followed his gaze toward the tree line where the water lapped against half-submerged trunks. Something pale was moving, slow and deliberate, as if walking from the woods into the reservoir itself. At first Jesse thought it was just driftwood, bleached and half-sunk, but then it shifted. The angle of a shoulder, the bony ridge of a chest glistening under moonlight. It was a man, or the shape of one, too thin, ribs jutting out as if the skin had been stretched tight and forgotten. The head lolled forward, but when it turned toward them, they could see a grin cut across the face, not joyous or drunk, but fixed, impossibly wide. The teeth seemed to catch the light as though they'd been waiting for someone to notice. No one spoke for a long moment. Billy reached for the small flashlight he kept by his tackle box and flicked it on, sweeping the beam across the water. The figure stood waist-deep, arms hanging too long, fingers splayed out just above the surface. Its eyes reflected back like those of a night animal, but there was a knowing in them, a recognition that made Jesse's stomach twist. "Probably some meth head," Billy said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Come down from Jasper or some damn place. Folks camp out here all the time." Yet no one believed him. Meth heads didn't stand knee-deep in lake water grinning at fishermen in the middle of the night. Mark muttered that they ought to pack up, but Shane, reckless as ever, cupped his hands to his mouth and hollered across the water, "Hey, you all right out there?" The figure tilted its head, that grin widening, and then it stepped forward. Not with the splash and stumble of a man wading through mud, but smoothly, silently, as if the water parted for it. That was enough for Jesse. He yanked his line in, tackle clattering at his feet, and hissed that they needed to go. Billy hesitated, pride wrestling with the unease crawling over them all, but the look in those reflective eyes convinced him. He cranked the motor, the old Evinrude coughing before it caught, and the boat began to churn away from the inlet. Jesse risked one last glance backward and saw the figure still there, now chest deep, watching, that grin fixed and awful. They didn't speak on the way back, the slap of water against the hull filling the silence. The lantern had been extinguished in their hurry, leaving only the moon to guide them. The dock lights finally came into view, a scatter of orange glows along the shoreline where trucks waited. Relief loosened Jesse's chest until Billy said, "Where's Shane?" The boat rocked as they all looked around. The cooler was there, Jesse's rod, Mark's tackle box, but the space Shane had occupied was empty. Billy swore and cut the motor, the reservoir swallowing them in quiet again. "He was just here," Jesse stammered, though even as he said it, he realized he hadn't heard Shane's laugh or voice since they'd left the inlet. They circled back, flashlights probing the dark water, calling his name until their throats were raw. Nothing answered but the lap of the lake and the occasional cry of a night bird. They searched until dawn, until the sheriff's deputies showed up with their spotlights and questions that never found answers. No body was ever recovered, no sign of where he'd gone. The others tried to explain what they'd seen, but their words tangled. A man, but not a man. Too thin, too grinning, eyes like an animal, moving like water itself. The deputies scribbled notes and exchanged looks, the kind reserved for drunks or liars. Weeks later, Jesse returned alone, drawn by something he couldn't name. He parked by the same inlet, the air heavy with the rot of fallen pine needles and stagnant water. As he stood at the shoreline, the frogs and cicadas fell silent all at once. The reservoir stretched out black and endless, and there, just beyond the first line of trees, he saw movement. A pale shape, impossibly thin, standing waist-deep, grinning. Beside it, another figure, shoulders hunched, mouth stretched far too wide in a terrible smile. This one wore the shredded remains of a t-shirt Jesse recognized. The laughter that rose from the water was Shane's, but twisted, stretched, and hungry. Jesse dropped his rod and ran, knowing in his bones that once the reservoir took a man, it never gave him back except in a form that was not his own. And sometimes when the air is heavy and the frogs go silent, fishermen on Sam Rayburn swear they see two figures standing in the shallows, watching with those reflective eyes and grins too wide for any human face, waiting for another to join them in the dark water. The first time Owen saw the hanged man, he thought he was still dreaming. It was sometime after 3 in the morning, the air outside his tent sticky with the kind of heat that never quite lets up in the Texas hill country, even in October. The cicadas had gone quiet, and the silence itself had pulled him awake, that absence of sound like a sudden shift in the air pressure before a storm. He unzipped the flap just enough to poke his head out, the world still dark but touched by a strange glow filtering down through the canopy of twisted big-tooth maples. The trees looked skeletal, their limbs curling and knotting like arthritic fingers. And then, right there in the crooked Y of a maple no more than 30 feet from where he sat, he saw it. A man hanging by the neck, head tilted forward, body swaying slightly, though there was no breeze. The rope cut deep into the bark above, and in the half-light he could see the white gleam of exposed flesh where the cord had chewed the skin. Owen blinked hard, rubbed his eyes, looked again. The branch was bare. The man was gone. Only the tree remained, bent and twisted in its own tortured shape. But even from where he sat, he could make out the deep grooves circling the branch, darkened scars in the bark that hadn't been there earlier that evening when he strung his lantern. He told himself he was overtired, that the long hike into lost maples had worn him down and his brain was cooking up hallucinations. He had come alone, chasing quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like you've escaped everything. His ex had told him he was addicted to solitude, that it wasn't healthy. He'd laughed it off, but now, sitting half out of his tent with sweat crawling down his back, he wondered if maybe she had been right. He ducked back inside, zipped the flap, and sat staring at the nylon fabric, willing himself not to listen for the sound of rope creaking under weight. The cicadas never returned. The woods outside stayed deathly still until morning. By the time the sun cut through the trees, he had convinced himself to check. The twisted maple stood the same, its leaves red and gold, the bark scarred where something had indeed dug deep circles into the limb. He ran his hand across it and felt the grooves. Not the kind of damage an animal makes, not lightning or disease. It was clean, precise, the way a rope digs in over time. He dropped his hand fast as if burned and looked around to see if anyone else was nearby. A family was setting up camp 2 clearings down, kids laughing, their voices too normal, too alive to match what he had seen. He told himself not to mention it. He packed his stove, boiled water for coffee, and tried to shake the creeping thought that something in these woods had left its mark and chosen him to see it. The day passed easily enough. He hiked the East Trail, sweating through switchbacks, distracted by limestone cliffs and still pools of water that reflected the maples in perfect red gold. The beauty was undeniable, but he couldn't stop glancing at the trees, their limbs too human in shape, as though waiting for someone to fill their crooked arms. He told himself he wouldn't spend another night. He'd break camp, head back to his truck, find a cheap motel in Bandera or Kerrville and forget this place. But when he returned at dusk, sore and drained, something in the air settled heavy on him. The grove was waiting. His tent sat small and lonely under the maples, the scars on the branch above catching the fading light. He thought about leaving then and there, but the idea of walking the narrow trails in darkness with those twisted branches reaching overhead made his stomach knot worse than staying. He tried whiskey to cut the edge. He sat with a flask by the campfire, watching the flames jump. The family down the way had gone silent early, their fire dead, the woods too big for his little circle of light. He kept catching himself looking at the same tree. Midnight dragged into morning. His eyes drooped, his neck snapped awake, and just as he was about to crawl into his tent, he saw him again. The hanged man, this time closer, no more than 10 feet from the firelight. His boots were old, scuffed cowboy boots, his jeans worn through at the knees, a plaid shirt dangling loose around a body that looked long dead. The head hung low, chin to chest, but the rope was clear, the same branch scarred deeper than before. And this time the body swayed, forward and back, like something nudging it unseen. Owen dropped the flask, scrambled to his feet, firelight shaking shadows up the trees. He blinked once, twice, gone, only the tree, the fire, the night. But the branch above groaned as if still holding weight, and when he stared long enough, he swore he saw the scars deepen, bark curling back, fresh sap bleeding like pus. He didn't sleep. He sat until dawn, every muscle rigid. When the family packed their things and drove off in the morning, he almost begged them to let him tag along. Pride stopped him. He boiled more coffee, tried to shake the tremor in his hands, and told himself he would leave at noon. Noon came and went. His legs wouldn't move him. It was as if the grove had him pinned, the maples closing around like a cage. By late afternoon, clouds rolled in, thick and low, shadows crawling early across the ground. He stood, decided to tear down the tent. And when he turned, the hanged man was there again. Not on the branch, not swaying, but standing on the ground, rope still tight around his neck, eyes black and wet, fixed on Owen. The skin on his neck split open, purpled and torn, the rope burns raw. Owen stumbled back, tripped over his own gear, blinked, and the man was gone. The ground where he had stood bore grooves. 2 long drag marks like heels scraping the dirt. Panic clawed at him. He packed blind, shoving things into his bag, ripping down the tent poles. He left half his gear behind, threw the rest over his shoulder, and staggered toward the trail. The woods pressed close, darker than they should have been. Every tree seemed to bear scars now, rope burns twisting around branches, circling trunks. He pushed faster, nearly running, breath ragged. Somewhere behind him, rope creaked, not once, but over and over in rhythm, as if dozens swung in unison. He didn't dare look back. The sound followed him, closer, tighter, until the trail spat him onto the gravel parking lot where his truck sat alone. He tore the door open, threw himself inside, and started the engine with hands that shook so badly he dropped the keys twice. As he pulled out, headlights caught the trees lining the lot. Every branch carried a scar. Some still dripped sap like blood. In the glow, just for a second, he thought he saw figures hanging, dozens of them, heads bowed, swaying in the still air. Then the road turned and the forest vanished behind him. He didn't stop until Bandera, where he pulled into the first motel he saw, collapsed onto the bed, still filthy and shaking, and passed into a half-sleep where rope creaked and branches groaned until sunrise. When he checked out the next morning, his eyes bloodshot and hands raw from gripping the wheel, the clerk asked if he had come down from Lost Maples. He nodded once. The clerk looked at him carefully, then said low, as if not meant to be overheard, "You saw him, didn't you?" Owen didn't answer, but the man smiled, the kind of smile that knows. "They say he was the first one hanged in the county. Horse thief, buried him under those maples, but you can't hang a man on cursed wood. He just keeps coming back. Every October. Leaves the bark scarred and the folks who see him worse." Owen drove north after that, away from the park, away from Texas if he could help it. But no matter how many miles he put behind him, he carried the sound, the slow swing of a rope under dead weight, echoing in his ears. And sometimes when he stopped at night, no matter where he was, he swore he could see the trees outside scarred in the same way, the bark cut in perfect circles, waiting for someone else to step too close. We pulled into Dinosaur Valley State Park late enough that the sky had cooled from white to pewter, and the cicadas changed from whining to a sawtooth rasp. The low hills on both sides of the Paluxy River were the color of old bones. I'd driven down from Fort Worth with my nephew and 2 of his college friends, because that is how guilt expresses itself in middle age. You buy a tent you will only use once. You promise to show kids the fossil footprints that hooked you when you were 8, and your father still took you anywhere. The entrance road dipped under live oaks and stunted juniper, and we rolled across the low water crossing, the river no more than a wide sheet of glass bruised by the last month of drought. I could see the flat limestone plates in the shallows, and the round, discrete basins where dinosaur toes had pressed mud 90 million years ago. The boys piled out, talking in a reverent hush that expanded and popped as soon as their sneakers hit gravel. They were good kids with loud opinions. Zach, my sister's son, had shaved his head and grown a beard, then decided he didn't like the beard and kept it anyway. Eli wore army surplus like armor. Dante had a smile that always got there ahead of anything he said. I had never been the chaperone type. I teach shop and coach JV baseball at a high school out in Weatherford. My tools fit better in my hand than most people do. I was doing my sister a favor. I was doing myself the kindness of not spending one more weekend sitting in my rental listening to the duplex neighbor's baby monitor hiss through the wall while I couldn't stop hearing another monitor that had gone quiet. Years ago, we reserved a site along the river road, just a little past the big fiberglass tyrannosaurs that have been sun-faded since the Johnson administration. The camp host, a woman with a gray ponytail and a nose that looked like it had been set twice, leaned from her golf cart and squinted at us. "Y'all picked a hot one," she said. "We're from Texas," Dante said. "We don't mind." The host's eyes slid to me and softened in the way people do when they guess your backstory and decide to be kind. "River's low, but the tracks are nice and clean. The ballroom site looks like someone mopped it. Watch your footing at Blue Hole. Ledges are slick. Don't walk the riverbed after dark. We had some hogs come through last week. Don't leave food out." "We got it," Zach said. The host tapped her brake pedal, then said like it was an afterthought, "If you hear singing, don't follow." Eli laughed, then stopped when she didn't smile back. "Like coyotes?" he asked. Her face didn't change. "Like singing?" "You'll hear it if you stay up. Folks always do when the water's this low." She rolled away before we could ask anything else. Dante looked pleased. He liked ghost stories, I could tell. Kids tell you what they want to be scared by. They hand you the size of the knife, and that's the one you cut them with. We set up camp under pecans that dropped shells like gravel. I got the fire going with mesquite chunks and a lighter because, despite their energy and ambition, the boys had never lit anything that wasn't on a screen. By 9, we had brats blistering, and the night had thickened and the river had become a black ribbon threaded with pale stones that caught the firelight and held it. The park quieted in layers. Families zipped tents. Someone strummed a guitar in a campsite up the road. Cars on Highway 67 sighed like distant waves. Farther out, you could feel the empty. Texas is not a blankness. It is a presence that sits on you with both hands. We talked in circles and pretended we were not waiting for anything. I told them about the first time my father brought me to see the tracks, how he'd lifted me and I'd put my sneakers into the saucer-shaped prints and felt the old fear of the thing that made them, not because I thought it was still there, but because the idea of the ground remembering anything at all shook me in a way I couldn't articulate. I had not been back since my daughter got sick. I didn't say that part. Some things you keep like a blade in your pocket just to feel it. I could still hear the pump of the hospital machine that had kept her alive 6 days. It was not a lullaby, but it was steady, and I had learned to sleep to it, and afterward I could not sleep to anything else. Around 11, a wind came up off the water. It smelled like wet limestone, like the inside of an old well. The fire collapsed on itself and sighed. The guitar stopped. The park held its breath. A barred owl called from the trees with a voice like a stalled engine. Then the singing started. It came from the river, from that thin stretch of polished rock where the Paluxy spread itself so wide it forgot to be a river. It was quiet at first, the way a mother hums when she is listening to her own voice and not the words. It was a tune I knew and did not. Something about horses and dark fields and the promise that morning will come. The boys' faces turned in unison. The sound settled against the shore, then backed away, drawing toward the middle of the river as if it walked there. "Creepy," Dante breathed, smiling. He stood. "Let's go," he said. The smart thing to do was sit. The smart thing was call out something like, "Hey, you okay?" Then not move. I have been told I am a very smart man. I have also stepped into a moving lathe because I believed I could control my balance. I told them to keep their lights off. We left the fire and walked down through grass that had taken the heat of the day and was giving it back in a low exhale. The river stones were cool on my soles even through my boots. The moon was a white coin caught in a cottonwood and it slept there, throwing gauzy light over the limestone shelves. The singing slid upstream. It wasn't coyotes. It wasn't a radio or a drunk. It had a human wobble when you reach for a note you aren't sure you deserve. It rose and fell in a patience that felt older than breath. We fanned out across the rock. The Paluxy was low enough that the channels were narrow, strips of black between broad chalk. I could see the trackways as dark pools where the toes had pressed deep and water held. The boys were ahead of me, all knees and elbows. Eli slipped and caught himself with a laugh that died fast. The singing stopped. The river was suddenly only a moving sheet. Even in that silence, when your nerves are strings plucked by nothing, you will always say something, Dante said. "Hello," in the voice you use when it is too dark to see your father and you think he is standing behind you. No one answered. We had ranged no more than 50 yards from camp. Behind us, the dim gold of the fire was a low eye. In front of us, the flat stone ran to the opposite bank where cedar and oak stood with their feet in the dark. Eli played his light across the rock with a thumb as if he could dial the night down. The beam passed over the dinosaur prints stamped in the riverbed, like the interrupted steps of a soldier. Some held water slick as oil. Some were empty, their bottoms scabbed with mud cracked into hexagons. The adolescent prints, the little comas pressed beside the big round ones, had always scared me more than the giant. Fear is common when it is scaled down. That is why dolls are worse than statues. We were about to give up and go back, and that would have been sane and fine, when the singing resumed behind us, its breath skimming the backs of our necks. It did not sound like it had moved. It sounded like we had been turned around. I pivoted, shining my light. Zach grabbed my sleeve. "She's over there," he whispered, his chin pointed downstream. The voice drifted that way and hushed itself like a finger on lips. I wanted to call out, but could not decide which name to use. That will tell you something about me. We followed because following is hardwired. The trackway widened and then narrowed as if we were walking the spine of a great white animal. The water on our right deepened into a bowl that had eaten enough rock to make a small cliff. On the left, the slab stepped down like a staircase carved by a drunk. The dust collected in thin films that lifted and swirled with our boots. Once Dante stopped and crouched and touched his fingers to a print and said, "Warm," and laughed because he knew that made no sense. We reached a point where the river fed through a bottleneck, and the footprints were clustered like a dance. "It is called the ballroom site," the ranger had said, "and if you stand there long enough, your sense of scale will betray you." The prints overlapped like conversations. Some were saucers, some narrow and six-toed. I had read the signage years ago. Theropod, sauropod, a child's taxonomy of menace and size. I stood within a double set of two-toed impressions and thought something had walked here on tiptoe and wanted not to be seen. The singing arrived with us and stopped. The silence that replaced it was not the parks. The river had gone quiet under a lull that felt deliberate. Eli swept his flashlight through the churn of tracks. The beam passed over a set of small impressions near the center. Too clean to be dinosaur, too crisp to be old. Bare feet. The prints were no longer than my palm and as narrow as hunger. They tracked a wavering path across stone, then into the water. Each small bowl brimmed with liquid, and at first my mind supplied rain. It had not rained in 3 weeks. The liquid was too dark, too thick, and the first smell was iron, and then come all the words you never want to say to a child. "Jesus," Zach said. Dante took a step closer and the soles of his sneakers whispered on dust. He pointed at the basin of the nearest print as if the thing in it were an animal he might pet. "Back," I said, my voice too loud. My light shook. The wind came back and swung through the pecans on the bank like a whisper in a stairwell. We stared at the red pooled in the prints. It was clean. No suspended sand, no insect tracks or leaves, as if it had filled fresh. It was so bright that the night seemed to tilt toward it. It reflected the moon as a broken coin. Eli took a picture with his phone. The shutter noise sounded obscene. He said we should tell someone, and he was right, but he did not move. The boys were magnets, and those small bowls were the thing that pulled on iron. I made the boys go. I put a hand on Zach's shoulder. and another on the back of Dante's warm neck and turned them and let their bodies lead their brains. We walked the way you walk when you are on ice you suspect is thin. When we reached the camp road, the sound of a truck on Highway 205 came slanting through the trees and felt like waking from a bad nap. We went to the camp host and told her, and she listened and did not look surprised. She called the ranger and then they phoned the sheriff's office. We stood in the puddle of a sodium lamp, while moths battered themselves to death in yellow light. The ranger who arrived was a woman in her 30s. With her hair coiled tight in a belt that held more tools than mine ever had, she was polite and efficient and did not tell us we were idiots. She walked us back and stood with her hands in her pockets and looked at the trackway and the small red wells. The river had started to talk again, but softer, as if it didn't want to interrupt. The ranger breathed through her mouth and frowned and bent and did not touch anything. Hogs, Eli offered weakly, like he had a stake in it being something explainable. The ranger shook her head. There's no scat, no drag, no splatter. That's not how blood behaves on limestone. She looked at me like I might argue with the physics of fluids. You said you heard singing. I nodded. I felt stupid. The words felt like I had spit on my own thumb and tried to put out a fire. Other folks have reported it, she said. When the water's like this, mostly around midnight, please don't walk the river again after dark. She turned to Zach and Dante. You boys hear me? They nodded with solemnity. She made them say it back. The sheriff's deputy arrived and took our statements and photographed what Eli had photographed. He had a belly like a poured-in-place countertop and a mustache that had probably looked good in 1991. He did not joke. He had stopped telling jokes to strangers years ago. We get missing persons sometimes, he said. Not as reassurance, but as disclosure. Kids walk off from Glen Rose, mostly back before school starts. He said nothing about their outcomes. He told us to go back to our site and to try to sleep. He said a search of the river would start at first light. He kept looking at the little bowl prints and blinking like he was trying to blink them into being something else. We tried sleeping. Zach snored by habit and Dante snored by stubbornness, and Eli didn't snore at all. I lay with my eyes open and watched the outline of the pecan leaves shake against the sky. The humming started again around 2. This time it was higher, as if whoever was singing had sat up in bed. I had been waiting to hear it the way you wait to hear your name called in a doctor's office. I knew it would happen and had convinced myself I would ignore it. I lay there until Zach breathed, "You hear that?" And Dante said, "She sounds closer," and Eli said nothing. I was the adult. I was the chaperone. I was the man who had sat in a hospital room and put one hand on his wife's back while the machine hummed. I took the flashlight and I took my pocket knife because people carry knives when they are afraid of feeling useless. And we walked again down to the river. This time the song led us upstream, toward where the track site narrows and the limestone slabs step up toward the bank. We kept the light low. The last thing I wanted was for our presence to become a fact. The song stayed ahead of us like a candle you never quite reached. Once it shifted to the left and my light caught an animal on the bank. Its eyes 2 flat coins, and I realized it was a feral hog, some 150 pounds of rooter with a wet snout, and it stood listening, as if even the hog wanted to know who was singing. It turned and trotted into the cedar, not afraid, just disinterested, and I felt relieved in a way that shamed me. The tracks were darker than the surrounding stone, the way old bruises are darker than new skin. I stepped carefully, not because I feared to step where dinosaurs had, but because I feared to step where a child had. The small prints appeared again in a scatter near the water's edge. They led us to a shallow ledge and dropped. The water in the nearest was fresh red. The far ones were filmed dull. The more I looked, the less certain I was of time. I did not say that out loud. "Do you hear it?" Dante whispered. "It stopped," Eli said. We stood for a count of 10. The river made the small clinking noises that water makes against stone when it is deciding to hurry. Zach said, "She's right there," and pointed up the bank where a sugarberry tree leaned out and its roots were a black skeleton in the air. I saw what he saw because he told me to, and that is how perception bends. Between 2 bowls a shape lighter than the night moved. The song returned, very soft, as if it came from someone singing into their own hands. There is a second when you step into a nursery, and your baby has finally gone down and you force your feet to move like clouds. The singing had that deliberate quiet. I should have called out. I should have taken the ranger's advice and walked backward until my calves hit our tent and kept going until I saw the morning. I had never been good at backing away. That is how you get your hand caught between a plank and a blade. I moved uphill and the boys, because they were boys, came behind me. The figure bolted at the sound of our feet and laughter rose, pure and light and wrong and cut off like someone pinched a wire. We reached the top of the bank. The ground was a thin skin of soil over limestone, pierced by roots that knitted around emptiness. We found nothing but crushed grass, and a few feet beyond, on an open patch where white dust blew and settled fast, a sequence of small bare prints that ran toward the park road and stopped. They didn't fade. They didn't lighten. They stopped like a child had jumped and never come down. My throat felt raw. I looked back at the river and saw the ballroom site shining with pools and the long trackways like sentences you only read when there is no one left to correct you. I held my light and saw something else. In a line parallel to the small prints by the river spaced wider, each basin deep, were prints of another kind. Not dinosaur. Not human. I had no reference point for them, only a reflex that crawled through my muscles and made me want to stand with my back against something. They were not tracks left by weight. They were impressions of absence. Where the rock should have risen, it dipped. Where dust should have settled, it blew across and could not stick. I blinked and they were there and not there. I could sense only that whatever had made them had made a decision to be here and here and here, and then to stop being anywhere. We were quiet until Zach whispered, "Uncle Mike." The title took me out of whatever eddy I had fallen into. I told them it was time to go, and I said it in a way that didn't make room for democracy. When dawn came, I poured bad coffee and watched the rangers wade the river. The deputy came back with a man in a white hat, who was older and did not introduce himself. A search team followed the banks and pushed through cedar, and found nothing that was a person. By mid-morning, the park was full of parents who had promised their kids dinosaurs for breakfast, and had gotten only tape and men talking into radios. The boys wanted to leave and then changed their minds and then wanted to leave again, fracturing around some pride I couldn't see. We drove into Glen Rose and sat on the courthouse square and ate kolaches with no appetite, while sun lifted out of the streets like somebody had laid a hot mirror over them. Eli bought a cheap fishing pole at a hardware store that also sold formal dresses. Dante flirted with a girl at the counter and forgot to pay for his soda, and went back red-faced. Zach walked the square 3 times and came back from each lap more silent. We should have packed up and gone home, but somewhere in me there is a person who believes you should not give a thing the right to chase you. I told them one more night and then we would go. The ranger looked at me hard when I said it, but she did not forbid it. People like her are paid not to forbid. The day dragged like a wet shirt. We swam at Blue Hole where the ledges are lime-scaled and the water is cold enough to make teeth ache. Families laughed and flung themselves off the flat rocks. That little cove felt like a real place. The rest of the park felt like stage scenery chewed by the previous act. Late in the afternoon, the ranger walked through the camp loop and said they had found nothing and would continue at dawn. She said, "Be safe." She did not say, "Don't leave." The host with the gray ponytail leaned on her golf cart and watched us like she knew how we'd end this. Night came as it always does, without consultation. We ate hot dogs and talked in the way that is mostly quiet between words. The river rustled. The cicadas fired themselves like small engines pulling hill. When the singing started, it came from farther downstream, from a place where the riverbed widens and the prints are shallow and scattered. It was not the same tune. It was a nursery rhyme with a bounce that made it worse. Dante said no and shook his head. Eli was already standing. I told them to stay. I told them I would go, and I told myself that was the father in me and not the idiot. I took the flashlight. I took the knife. I took the name of my daughter and held it in my mouth like a coin I might need to pay for something. The river was a whisper, the kind it makes when a breeze folds and unfolds it. I walked along the margins and felt the cool through my boots. The singing came from the ballroom site again, as if that place were a mouth and it was learning to shape the vowels. I stood at the edge of it and kept my light off and let my eyes adjust until everything was graphite and milk. The pools were empty of red now, or my eyes rebelled, and what I saw was only water holding a white moon. I said very quietly, "Where are you?" And the answer was laughter that did not ripple the air. It sounded like the idea of laughter. I shined the light and caught her at the far edge of the site, back to me, hair wet and hanging, a thin dress clinging to knees. She stood with her feet in 2 old prints that were filled to the brim with something that did not reflect. Her head tilted, The humming traveled to me and became a pressure under my eyes. I thought, say your name because names have power. I thought, this is a child. I thought a lot of things you think at the edge of what is wrong. Then she turned. Her face was the face of my daughter at 4. Not an approximation. Not a hint. It was my girl. Her mouth soft, her lashes wet. The small freckle near her ear that I had kissed 100 times because I liked the way it surprised me in the morning. She lifted her arms the way my daughter had when she wanted up. The pools around her feet were dark as if they had no bottom. People tell you certain things are impossible. I have seen impossible things done by people who wanted something enough. I stepped forward. Halfway across the ballroom, the stone under my boot wasn't there, or rather it was there, but it remembered a foot and made room for mine as if it had been waiting for me my whole life. I dropped to my knee and caught myself with one hand, my fingers sliding into a depression that fit them too well. The humming rose and deepened until it was pressure in my throat and a taste in my mouth like old copper pipe. My light jittered and slid and glanced off shallow basins that were suddenly all full. They filled not from above but from below, as if the rock itself bled. I stood because the thing with my daughter's face was laughing and crying, the way kids do when they want to see what you'll do. I walked the last few feet and stopped at the nearest set of small prints brimming with red. I saw at last that the surface of the liquid did not behave like water. It did not dimple when the wind passed. It held itself in a tense skin that bulged just enough to show me it was not at rest. Things rose to the surface like small pale flowers turning. They were fingernails. They were teeth. What are you? I asked. And the voice that answered used my wife's tone when she was telling me not to talk about something in front of the child. Come closer, it said, patting the air. And there was my daughter's outline, and I stepped because I would always step. And the rock gave under me and firmed again around my boot like a hand closing. I pulled it, did not let me go. The print under my foot had taken the shape of it as if it had always belonged to me, and I could feel the stone around my ankle like cool flesh, like a band that tightened with every heartbeat. I did not scream. I have screamed for lesser things. I reached down for my laces and my fingers found mud where there had been leather. In the red bowl to my right, a small hand rose and lay against the surface, palm up, patient. My light jittered and found the girl, and her mouth opened the way my daughter's mouth had when she slept, and inside was only more river. From the bank there was a shout that had my name in it. Zach's voice tore something in me. The girl's head flicked toward the sound with an animal snap, and the song swelled the way a train swells when it comes into a station. And I turned my knife and cut the tongue of my boot. Sawed it, felt the blade nick skin, stood on my free heel and yanked. The stone held, then released with a wet sound. I fell backward into 2 other prints, and they accepted me with a greed that was only patient until it wasn't. My calves sank, then my thighs. Cold climbed me like hands around both legs, not squeezing, just waiting for me to settle. I scrambled, throwing myself sideways, and the rock set like cement around my knees. Zach was on the riverbed. Then and Eli and Dante were behind him, all 3 of them standing in the safe places because they still believed such things existed. Zach called my name again like I could have forgotten it. The girl stood in her pools and watched them with a benevolent curiosity that made my stomach turn. She reached out her hands in invitation, and her fingernails were not fingernails. They were crescent moons cut from thin stone. When she smiled, I saw that every tooth was the edge of a broken shell. "Don't come," I shouted, and my voice cracked. I shifted my weight, and the stone under my left knee softened, then closed again. It did not mind being cheated. It had waited longer than I had been alive. It could wait another minute. The boys froze because they trusted my voice, and I filled with a love so sharp it broke me. The humming stopped, and the silence that followed was not a silence. It was the high, thin sound of heat on car metal. It was memory at the edge of hearing. It was the pump of a machine that keeps a small heart moving. The girl shrugged as if to say, "Men always make this harder than it needs to be," and lifted 1 foot from her basin. The blood clung in a long rope that did not break until the motion required it. She put her foot down in an empty dinosaur print, and it filled at once. On the rock above the waterline, a new row of small impressions crinkled into being, not pressed but rising like blisters. They led toward the boys. The girl smiled. I understood that she was not a girl, not even a how. She was the fact of the ground remembering. She was the habit of place. When the river dropped and the trackways bared themselves, the memory in the rock wanted to walk again. It wanted company. It took what shape moved toward it. Long ago it held giant fear. Now it wanted small songs. It would make itself a child who could ask. In the end, it was Dante who did what saved anyone. He threw the fishing pole. It clattered across the rock and slid into the basin to my right, and something in that red skin flinched back like a startled anemone. The movement loosened the grip on my knees just enough that my weight slid and one leg popped free. I do not remember the pain, only the stone's reluctance, like guilt letting go. I rolled like a bad actor in a war movie and pulled myself with my elbows until my fingers caught an edge where the riverbed lifted. I crawled backward, the rock trying to pretend it had not just held me, and the girl watched with a face I could not bear and hummed a tune that my bones had known before I was born. The boys got to me and grabbed my shoulders and my waistband and the back of my shirt, and together we became a single animal whose only thought was away. We made the grass at the bank and fell there, panting, and the stars above seemed like holes punched in a flat black thing, and for once that metaphor did not feel like a lie. The singing stopped. The river made sounds like relief. Behind us I heard the slow, satisfied burps of liquid settling and realized I had heard that sound before and mistaken it for something else. I do not know how long we lay there. At some point the night regained its ordinary menace and the owl started in again, and a camper somewhere laughed at a joke that could not have been funny. We left before dawn. We did not pack neatly. We didn't check the back seat. I limped and my legs wore bands of dark that soap did not touch. At the park gate, the host sat in her cart with a styrofoam cup and watched us pass. She lifted 2 fingers off the wheel in a soldier's small salute. In the rearview mirror, I saw the fiberglass tyrannosaur looking down with its old watery eye. On Highway 67, the sky went from black to bruised to a hard nickel, and then came the red stripe at the horizon. That looks like it should mean something. We did not speak until we hit Cleburne. Then Zach said, "Did you see her?" And the sound of his voice almost put me in a ditch. I said yes and no, and that we were never going back there, and that he should not tell my sister, and then that he should tell her everything. I kept my eyes on the road because if I looked away, I believed the white line would climb onto the hood and then into the cab and then into my mouth. At home, I went into the shower and turned it too hot and let it beat the backs of my knees until I understood that some parts of me would stay cool forever now. I sat on the edge of my bed with a towel around my waist and tried to figure out what kind of man I had been on that river, and did not come to a conclusion. In my duplex through the wall, the baby monitor hissed. Then I realized that no, the neighbor was out of town. The hiss was not a machine. It was a mouth humming under breath. A small girl's voice. The tune from the river, so soft that if I had not just heard it in the same way, it might have sounded only like the air in a vent. I moved to the window. The parking lot lay empty, but for my truck and a soda can someone had crushed under heel. The sun had risen enough to silver the gravel into scabbed scales. On the concrete walk in front of my door were small bare prints in a line, clear as script, each holding a perfect dark circle that looked black until you leaned close and saw red. They stopped on my mat. The last 2 were spaced wide, as if a child had jumped. Beyond them there was nothing. Not a smear, not a drip, only dry concrete that went unmarked to the stairs and down into the day. When the humming slips around my bed at night, it is always behind me. When it stops, the silence has shape. When it returns, it uses a tune I taught a child who did not live long enough to learn the whole thing. The prints on my stoop dry and darken and flake and then return after every rain, which feels like a blessing if you want it to. I do not go to lakes and I do not drive past Glen Rose. I keep my boots by the door, but I do not put them on when the singing starts. I lie still and let the hand in the rock close over any part of me it has the patience for, and I wait for morning while the ground remembers what my weight felt like. I came back to Jefferson after my mother died because the house wouldn't sell, and the attorney told me grief was cheaper than a mortgage. The place sits 3 blocks off Austin Street, a low chenille of roof and pine needles, a porch that leans as if listening to the road. Every afternoon I drove east on Highway 49 to the edge of Big Cypress Bayou and watched John boats slide out toward Caddo. I told myself I was getting fresh air. The truth was I had nowhere else to be. After 20 years of reporting for stations that changed call letters every time an owner ran out of ad money, my life had the same pieced-together feel as the bait shop counters around here, all scarred pine and tape. The only habit that had stuck with me was carrying a recorder. Not the fancy bag of gear I used to sling over my shoulder. Just a small black handheld with a red button and the patience to hold a moment still. People in Jefferson talk about the lake the way folks in other towns talk about their families. With fondness first, then with that small hitch in the throat that means the fondness is a lie or at least only half the truth. They tell you to take FM 134 over to Karnak, then turn down FM 198 toward Uncertain, the town that named itself for the way boats used to drift in as if by accident. They tell you to rent a cabin in the state park where the cypress grow like cathedral columns from black water, the air strung with Spanish moss that never dries. They tell you to bring a flashlight, a paper map, a knife, and to avoid the government ditch at night, because gators favor the straightaway and, besides, there are stories. They tell you not to listen too hard if you hear music. The first time I heard it, I was buying minnows I didn't need at Lulu's Bait and cold beer in Uncertain. The coolers hummed and the ceiling fan ticked. A woman with a name tag that said Dell poured coffee into a foam cup that bled heat into my palms. There was a radio behind the counter tuned to a gospel station out of Shreveport, thin voices fading in and out like they were walking across a field. The song ended, the DJ swallowed a consonant, and in the silence the lake cleared its throat. It was faint, not the slap of wave against hull or the whine of an outboard on another channel, but a collective sound that made the hair stiffen on the back of my neck. I stepped outside with my coffee and stood on the cracked lot. The wind was idle. The moss in the trees hardly moved. Somewhere out in the maze of water, a choir lifted their voices. I know how that sounds, and I know what it was not. It wasn't a boat. It wasn't the pines. It wasn't a loon. It had layers the way human voices do. I caught a high voice riding above the rest like a thread on a dark coat, then a low bed of notes moving with the certainty of tide. I lifted the recorder without thinking and pressed the button. The red light came on and said I was sane, and the music went on for as long as the length of a breath held longer than comfort. Then it stopped. Not a fade, a curtain drop. The stillness afterward felt like a held hand withdrawn. When I played back the file inside the shop, I heard only the ceiling fan and the murmur of the cooler. Dell listened over my shoulder. She was a small woman with knotted hands and eyes that had learned to keep the first thought private. When the playback ended, she nodded toward the door without looking at me and said, "You heard what you heard. You didn't catch it because it isn't for the machine." On the way home, I passed the sign for Caddo Lake State Park and the old CCC cabins that always look like they are apologizing for still standing. Spanish moss hung like drapery from the limbs, and the cypress knees along the shore reached up in the shape of pleading hands. I told myself I'd recorded nothing because my angle had been wrong or my mic was cheap. I told myself what any man tells himself when the world shows a seam. 3 nights later, the voices followed me home. It was late and the house had settled into the groaning quiet of timber drying. I washed dishes in my mother's deep sink, and when I turned off the faucet, there was a soft residual song that did not belong to water-leaving pipes. It came from the drain, low and narrow like people singing through cupped hands. I leaned close enough to smell the rust. It wasn't fear that kept me from jerking back. It was recognition. The same layered sound, the same lift and fall, the same sense that it was singing to keep time with a task rather than to perform for anyone. I set the recorder on the sill and pressed the button. This time the red light felt like an offense. I shut it off. I stood with my hand on the basin and listened until the voices thinned and a chill moved over my bare arms, and the song ended with the same clean cut. In the morning, I drove to the library on Polk Street. The histories of the lake live in a glass case there, along with a photograph of a church picnic where the men wear hats and the women squint against light. Caddo formed when the great raft clogged the Red River with timber and flooded everything behind it, a slow drowning over years. Later they put in a dam and lowered and raised the water like a chest rising and falling. Town names came and went with the level. Price's Store, Mound City, a settlement called Bethany that may have been a rumor, or a place where 2 families once planted corn. There are maps that show roads ending underwater, as if the draftsman lifted his pencil when he reached the edge of what he cared to know. I copied a few pages, and then did what I had been putting off. I took the boat that used to be my father's out of the shed, and remembered the way rope burns the palm when you pretend you still know knots. I ran Highway 43 through Karnak and turned down 2198 to the state park ramp, the tires crunching shells. The sky had that bruised color it gets before a front comes in from Louisiana. I launched at 4 and drifted toward Government Ditch, then cut north into the trees where the water turns the color of tea and you could believe depth is a lie. I killed the motor and let momentum do the quiet work. The cypress columns rose all around like the pews of a flooded sanctuary. It was a thought that arrived so clean I wondered if someone else had put it there. The voices found me when the wind died. The first note slid up as if the lake were taking a breath, then they steadied and grew. I sat on the thwart with the recorder in my pocket, and the feeling that to pull it out would be like cough during prayer. The melody was familiar in the way a smell is familiar. I heard words without consonants, shapes of belief without a tongue to carry them. From all around the sound moved in, and the trees made a corridor of it. The nearest cypress knee had the shape of a knuckle. The moss swayed a fraction. The chorus rose, paused on a note as fragile as a glass edge, and stopped. A chain of small bubbles came up near the bow as if something down there had let out a sigh. A skiff slid out of the trees to my right without a ripple. The man at the tiller wore a blue work shirt with the sleeves rolled, a cap that had once been white, and a face that had learned its lines outdoors. He cut power and the skiff glided in until silence met silence. He lifted his chin toward me the way men greet each other in places where greetings carry weight. "You don't want to anchor," he said. "I don't plan to. And you don't want to lower anything." "I haven't." "That's good." He set his skiff to drifting parallel to mine. We moved like two leaves in the same lazy gyre. He said his name was Leon Ritter, and that he did guide work when a man wanted fish or photographs. He didn't take folks after dark anymore. He said he could see I had listened. Then he told me not to do it again. His voice didn't threaten and it didn't plead. It reported like the weather. I asked how long he had lived out here. He said long enough to know the seasons of what's alive and what pretends. He said the lake is generous and that the price is attention. If you paid too much of it, you didn't get change. He said they used to talk about a town called Catahoula that slid under when the water had a bad season, and that there had been a church there. He said the choir was the last thing to leave a church and the first thing to come back. The way he said it, I understood he was not offering poetry. I did not tell him about the drain. I did not tell him about my recorder. He looked at my pocket and then away like a man forgiving a private sin. The next day I drove the gravel road that skirts the park and found a man who sold used sonar out of his carport. He had 3 units laid out on a card table, and each one looked like it had spent time at the bottom of the lake before drying itself and returning to the world. I handed over a damp stack of bills and went home with a depth finder and a cable that promised to tell me the shape of secrets. I met Leon at the ramp at dusk without calling it a plan. He had brought a thermos and a coil of new rope. I brought the sonar and a coil of old rope because I am my father's son, and never learned to trust what is new. The light gave one last flare against the flat water, and then retreated like a boy called home from a game. We moved into the trees. The world narrowed to a circle of dim water and trunks. Leon's spotlight picked out the pale scars on bark where debris had rubbed in storms. Moths came to die against the lens. When the voices came up that night, they did not come up gently. They flooded the dark like a congregation arriving through 2 doors at once. The lines braided until there was nowhere for silence to take hold. The sound did not ride the air so much as soak through it. I felt it along my arms as if the hair there were a tuning fork. Leon's jaw set and his hands worked rope on habit. I told myself I had imagined it before, that this was the true measure. It is strange what a man will do to keep a belief alive. He will choose the larger terror because it comes with the relief of certainty. I lowered the transducer because I could not keep myself from doing it. The cable ran through my fingers with a bite of chill, and when the sensor met the water, the display lit with the translation of another world. It showed a clean bottom in one moment, then a jumble of returns like a stone wall, then an oval rise like a mound. The boat drifted and the picture changed. A vertical line appeared on the screen, thin and insistent. A shadowed rectangle followed that could have been a foundation footprint if the lake allowed such words. The singing thickened. I felt the want of it, the way the sound tried to install itself in my chest and grow there. It was not hunger for me, and yet it made a hunger in me, the desire to go under and see the place that matched the shape. The first name they sang was not mine, and that saved me. It was a simple old name, and I heard Leon stiffen as if struck. He said it once in the plainer voice of a man confirming a thing that has just broken his knee. They sang it again, and the second time I heard the syllables of a surname inside the swell. The water around us lifted and settled. The air changed temperature the way it does by a waterfall when unseen motion makes a local weather. Leon took a step toward the gunnel and then wrapped the rope around the cleat as if to tie himself to the surface. He said not to answer. He said it calmly, as if civility mattered even here. Then they sang a second name, and it was my mother's. No last name. Her given name in the way my father used to say it when he was gentle. I told myself there must be another woman with her name drowned under the trees of a century ago. I told myself I was not unique and that there were a limited number of names in the world. I told myself what a child tells himself when he hears his own nickname spoken from a closet where a coat should hang. The voices did not shout, and they did not whisper. They sang the way you sing when you are standing on a porch and evening is a job you are happy to keep. They folded meaning into tone and set the tone against the water, and then waited for the water to carry it where it would. When I breathed, I smelled iron and wet wood and the faint resin of pine tar. The smell had an insistence that felt religious. Leon cut the motor and let us drift. He said, "We will not be here when they open the door." And then, because a man who has made a rule needs to test it in order to believe it, he said, "Just this once, I want to hear." I had known men who tempted trains by standing near tracks so they could feel how small they were and be grateful the world was larger. What we did next was not gratitude. It was the act of two fools who think they can inventory a miracle. We drifted across the return. The sonar drew a diagonally rising line as the bottom came up to meet us. The singing had a rhythm in it that was not 4/4 or 3/4, but something older, that knew about walking through water and keeping your feet under you. The first splash came off our port side. Not a fish, not a turtle. A soft strike as if a hand had separated itself from the dark and met the surface. Then there was a pull on the transducer cable that was not the work of current. The line went taut. The sensor stopped drawing what was beneath and started drawing its fear. I pulled the cable and it came with a smooth give until it did not. I felt the set of something on the far end and then the sound changed. They stopped singing together and one voice carried alone. It was the narrow high one I had heard that morning at Lulu's. A woman's voice with a quality of thin light. She sang my last name the way a teacher sings a roll call and waits. She held the last syllable like a coin between finger and thumb, and then in the space under that held note another voice came up from lower than low. It said my name as my father's father might have said it when he was angry and tired and ready for the thing to be over. The two met on the surface of my hearing and made a third that went down my spine in a clean line of cold. My hand let go. The cable burned through my palm and then went slack. The sensor vanished into the water, and with it, the part of me that had thought knowledge would be insulation. Leon cursed in a tone that had no blasphemy in it because it had too much. He pulled the starter rope and the motor gave us the sound of engine as prayer. The boat moved. The water held on a second longer as if to show us how long it could. Then we were sliding past the trunks and into a patch where stars had left their reflection on the skin. We did not speak on the way back. The ramp had a single light, dull as if it had been shining all day and only remembered itself when needed. I saw that Leon's hand had a strip of skin missing where rope had cut it, and that he was bleeding in a neat ribbon between his knuckles. He washed it in the lake without looking down. He said, "I'm not bringing anyone back there." I meant to leave it alone. I meant to be the man who has one close call and learns from it. The kind old men in Jefferson nod at from porch chairs. But the drain sang again 2 nights later, this time starting just as I clicked off the bathroom light as though the darkness were its conductor. I slept on the couch with the television on and woke to the chorus woven through the sound of a weatherman out of Tyler. It did not come only at night. It came through the whine of my refrigerator and the sigh of the vent in the kitchen. It slipped under the door and sat with me at the table and put its hand over mine. I knew then that what the recorder could not catch, the body could. And I knew what the voices wanted from me. I drove alone to Uncertain the following week after telling no one a thing that would have been too difficult to turn into sentences. The park road was empty. The ramp had silt on it in a way that revealed how often the world forgets its own borders. I launched with hands that knew their business better than I did, and let the motor idle just enough to make forward motion optional. The air was bright and hard. The cypress wore their moss like shawls. A blue heron lifted and then settled 2 trees over as if it had changed its mind about our arrangement. There is a place on the northern arm of the lake under a deep cradle of limbs where the water keeps its cold even in June. The Old men will tell you it is a spring or a pocket of shade that never learned to let go. I went there because my mother had taken me to picnic on the bank when my father was still walking out to the rig every morning with a lunch pail. I remembered the bite of ants on my foot and the way she had pressed a bottle cap into the skin to stop the sting. I remembered her humming in a minor key while she wrapped potato salad in wax paper. Memory has a way of closing the lake around you, and by the time I had the motor lifted and the oar in my hand, I was deeper than plan. The choir came up before noon. There was a patience in the sound that felt like a hand on the back of my head, guiding me to look down. I looked. The surface held the sky and the sky held back what the water offered. Then a breath of wind made ripples, and for 1 second the light shifted and showed me the slant of something squared. The corner of a roof at an angle wrong for this world. A ridge of shingles eaten to a skeleton. A bell rope turned into a strand of algae that moved like hair. When the light straightened, everything vanished again and there was only black under brown. They sang the way people sing when they are tired but will not stop because the song is a rope they are not done hauling. I took it in and felt the notes arrange themselves in my chest. It should have frightened me more than it did. It felt like the relief after a long drive when the turn finally appears. I untied the coil of old rope I had brought without admitting why, and looped it around my wrist because the body likes to say it is being safe even when it is making a story for the coroner. I put my hand over the gunnel and curled my fingers under the skin of the lake and waited for the cold to tell me what came next. The hand that took my wrist was not the hand of a drowned thing. It was not grotesque. It was warm. Warmer than the water around it, the way skin gets when blood hurries with intent. It did not pull, it held. The voices rose and braided around my name, and then came the shift. The cord they made changed color, and I felt the arrangement inside my chest tilt as if the seats had been moved while the lights were down. The song was not a lure anymore. It was a scaffold. It provided steps that matched my breath, and when I inhaled, water vapor held to the back of my throat and comforted it with the promise that it could be enough. I said my mother's name because I could not carry both the sound and silence by myself. The song answered with it, not a confirmation, a proof. The rope on my wrist tightened where it looped around the cleat, and I took that as a kind of courtesy. The lake telling me it did not wish to embarrass me by having me float away while I learned. The next breath went down deeper than it should have, and it did not ignite panic but pleasure. The water tasted like rust and pine and an old penny held under a tongue in church. The faces that rose into the rippled mirror were not swollen or torn. They were people who had gone under as themselves and stayed that way. They had mouths shaped for the words of hymns and eyes that looked up with the acceptance of long work. The woman with the high voice had hair like a gray net, and her mouth formed syllables I recognized from a song my mother hummed when she forgot my name on the last week in the hospital. The old man with the low note had a cleft in his chin that my grandfather had in a photograph taken on a drilling crew outside Marshall. They did not smile. They did not welcome. They held time and place the way singers do when they are not singing for an audience but for a grave. The rope creaked where it rubbed the cleat. The knot was bad because I had tied it. The fibers gave. The boat moved a foot, then two, and then the line slithered free and the slack fell into the water with me still attached. I heard the faint scrape of wood against cypress where the current offered a suggestion. The sound did not leave room for alarm. The song filled it. I leaned past the fulcrum of the gunnel and the weight took me whole. The world flipped. The water closed above my ears like a set of soft palms. The surface became a sky I no longer needed. I opened my mouth because that is what the music required, and I took the lake in. It was not drowning in the way we are taught to fear. It was letting a language enter the body. The notes I had carried were not mine. They moved through me with the assurance of migratory birds. They found roost and then rose again, enriched by the heat I had given them. My lungs did not collapse. They changed their work. They took the black tea water and turned it into a way to speak. The pressure on my ears became the pressure of hands on a back, urging posture. A bell rope brushed my cheek like a strand of hair, and a small fish nosed my knuckles with indifference. The woman with the high voice moved away not with a kick, but with the slow economy of something that has forgotten effort. The man with the low note tilted a fraction and the whole choir adjusted, listening for what I would give. I did not disappoint them. The new note found me like a place I had been meant to move into years ago and foolishly rented to someone else. Above me a boat shifted and slapped and became a story that would be told with a shrug, and then with a whisper, and then not told at all. The shore held its trees in place. The road back to Jefferson kept its potholes. Dell filled cups at Lulu's. Leon stared at a strip of healed rope burn and let his hands rest on the gunnel longer than habit required. The drain in my mother's kitchen sang to no one, and the moss in the cypresses put on new green like a well-worn coat. The choir did what choirs do. It learned the voice that had come to it. It bent the edges of the old songs to make room for new meanings. It stitched my name into the measure and made it into something somebody else would hear when they stood still in the wrong place for the right amount of time. We held the note that keeps the world where it is for one more day, and then, when the day did what days are built to do, we changed to the next. If you take FM 2198 to the end where the road meets water and you park where the mud makes a map of your tires, you will hear nothing if you hurry. If you stay beyond the hour when light lays down and the gnats come to taste you and the frogs begin to believe themselves, you might hear a chord built of patience. If you carry a recorder, it will not help you, and if you carry a knife, it will not protect you. The choir will sound like the inside of a church you are not sure you have the right to enter, and it will say your photograph name in the voice of someone you loved before you knew what love cost. You will feel your chest rearrange itself to make room for the old music. You will understand that the drowned towns never stopped doing what towns do. They will ask for your attention and then keep it. They will teach you how to breathe their way, and when the song opens its small door, you will step through because you have already been practicing all your life with every held breath and every long look and every word you meant to say to the living but saved for later. The water is ready. The voices are tired and the work goes on.